Hey, happy Friday afternoon. I'm Jimmy Young from Pro Cannabis Media. So happy to welcome you all to a very special live edition of Green Rush. You know, for over a year now, every Friday afternoon from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern, I've co-hosted this Business of Cannabis talk show with David Rabinovitz, a trusted friend and advisor. And we've had amazing guests from the cannabis industry from coast to coast. And today's show continues that dedication to high-end business discussions. Now he's going to be joined by Curt Dalton from Cannabis.net for this special edition on interstate commerce in cannabis. Me? Hey, I'm going to go head into the chat room after I play this soundbite or clip from an interview I did with Dimitri Downing from the Marijuana Industry Trade Association out of Arizona last week at MJ BizCon and MJ Unpacked. Now, Dimitri believes in the importance of interstate commerce for the patient and the industry professional.
You have to wrestle with how you deploy capital and plan for long term. And we all know interstate commerce is coming within 3 to 7 years. We need an industry that's going to advocate aggressively for interstate commerce. And when interstate commerce comes, hopefully, you won't have to manufacture in all these states. Just adjust to little things like labeling, testing, and packaging, etc. Now we've shifted over to paradigm 2 over the last 10, 12 years, which is the concept that we're kind of wrestling with right now, that we've inherited and kind of accepting merit-based applications, limited licensing applications. There can only be a few dispensaries. There can only be a few manufacturers. All that is nonsense. We need to fight for paradigm 3, which is the open markets, which is competition, which is opportunity, because ultimately paradigm 3 is going to be best for the patients and the consumers.
Welcome. I'm David Rabinovitz. We do this every Friday. Thanks for joining us here on Pro Cannabis Media in the Green Rush. I'm joined by my co-host, Curt Dalton, and by our exceptionally special guest that we're thrilled to have today, Professor Robert Mikos from Vanderbilt Law. This is basically for us a very special show. We're going to take a really deep dive into whether or not interstate commerce in cannabis is going to be allowed, or how it could be allowed, what the ramifications are. And I think we have the best lineup of industry guests that we have ever had on this show. So with that, I'm going to flip it to Curt, and then we're going to let the professor introduce himself and start the discussion going.
Thanks, David. Welcome, Professor. And for those folks just tuning in and kind of seeing some of the links out there, we did an article based on Professor Mikos's paper and got a tremendous amount of comments and shares. I think it's over 1,400 shares. Basically saying that interstate commerce, I'll let the professor correct me, may actually be legal for the cannabis and marijuana plant based on the dormancy commerce clause in the Constitution. So before you even get into the paper, Professor, what was the inspiration to kind of, one night at dinner, go down the road to the left and say, hey, I think marijuana interstate commerce is legal. Let me pull out some of those books in the library. How did it start? What was the germination of this paper?
It's a great question, but first, thanks both to you, Curt, and to you, David, for having me. Happy to be here this Friday afternoon. In large part, I saw what the states were doing, and I noticed that they've got these weird bubble-like markets. So Massachusetts will have its own cannabis market, its own cultivators and processors and retailers. And then, across the way, you've got Connecticut with its own set of suppliers, New York, New Jersey, Colorado, go down the list. And there's no cannabis moving across state lines, and actually very limited investment across state lines. And I think one day that just struck me as so odd in comparison to every other market we have out there. Now, you go to the grocery store now, you might be in Florida, but you'll see avocados from California. Tennessee, we're a big auto state, but we'll see autos made in Ohio. So normally we don't see this sort of segmentation or bubble-like markets in the state. We normally see that. And I know there's a constitutional doctrine out there, the Dormant Commerce Clause, that's designed to stop that. It's actually designed to promote free trade and the development of national markets. So I started to dig into, why isn't that dormant commerce clause operating here? Why is it that the states are allowed, and every state that's legalized cannabis right now bans the importation of out-of-state product, and a lot of them ban outside investors, non-residents, from investing in local industry. So I started asking, how is it that states are getting away with this? And I never got a satisfactory answer. One thing led to another. You keep digging, you keep digging, you keep digging, you discover, hey, maybe this is unsustainable. Maybe the states can't keep doing this. Maybe what they're doing, actually, they can legalize cannabis, but they can't say, we're going to legalize it only for insiders. You really got to treat those insiders and outsiders alike. And that's sort of where one thing led to another. It's just noticing that incongruity between cannabis and every other market that's out there.
So is this, I guess we'd say like the dormant commerce clause is the smoking gun of this debate. Does that include a Schedule I drug when that was put in? The federal government's CSA, Controlled Substance Act, has it as a Schedule I drug, cannabis, unfortunately. There's no precursor or excluding when it comes to a commerce clause if it's a illegal federal drug.
It's a great question. So in a nutshell, that dormant commerce clause, it is a default free trade principle. So this is the states, you can't unduly burden interstate commerce. But the question is, well, what if the federal government has made that commerce illegal?
Yeah.
And clearly Congress has done that. And I think the states, when they adopted all these bans on imports and exports and out-of-state investment, I think they kind of assumed that, hey, maybe Congress has turned off this principle. Because as I mentioned, the Dormant Commerce Clause is really a default constitutional principle. It's not explicitly stated in the Constitution. The court has just looked at that and said, we assume that Congress wants to promote free trade. But if it tells us otherwise, it can suspend this Dormant Commerce Clause. And I think the states all assumed, hey, Congress banned this. You've got no federal right to sell it, so we can do with it as we please. We can legalize, say Massachusetts, we're going to let locals grow it and sell it, but if you're an out-of-stater, you're out of luck. And I think everybody kind of bought into that without kind of testing that assumption. And what I've done in a couple of papers is really one called Interstate Commerce and Cannabis. It's really testing that assumption and kind of picking it apart. To the federal government's perspective, from Congress's perspective, it doesn't care where the cannabis comes from. It's not like it says, hey, you grow this stuff in Boston and sell it to somebody in Boston and we don't care. That's legal. But the moment you take it outside of Boston and take it into Connecticut or some other state, we care about it. Congress has no reason to care where cannabis comes from. Its objective in the Controlled Substances Act was to quash this market entirely, to wipe it out. So I think once you recognize that Congress doesn't care whether you're selling across state lines or entirely within a state, this idea that Congress has somehow permitted the states to discriminate against outsiders starts to fall apart. And that's why I think today, all of these barriers states have erected to interstate commerce and cannabis, they are subject to challenge under this Dormant Commerce Clause principle, notwithstanding that federal ban.
Would you say, this is the meat of it, you brought up the word test it. Spoke to a few lawyers today. What does that look like? We have a lot of stories about a guy named Dale Jackson from Georgia who has an autistic son, and he went across state lines, invited the press, bought some cannabis oil, brought it over, asked the press and police to follow him, arrest him if you want. Is that kind of what we're looking at for a test, that a medical license holder or a recreational license holder, say in Massachusetts, which will be a good lead in for another guest we have coming on, goes to California, orders from California, or ships it, says, here's my package, I'm putting it in the mail, or I'm driving it to New York or California, have the press follow him, please arrest me, my lawyer's with me. What does a test of this look like in reality?
Yeah, so that's one possibility, and that's a very sympathetic test. So if you want to push a legal theory like this, you want to find the most sympathetic case you can, and that might be a case of that. That's a patient, though, sort of just possessing it and bringing it across state lines. Another possibility, and there are actually several legal cases out there right now, test cases, including one in neighboring Maine. You could be an outsider, you want to invest in the cannabis market in another state. That state says, can't do that. We only allow residents to own our shops. Well, you could sue the state and ask the court for an injunction blocking that residency requirement for a cannabis license. And in fact, there have been such lawsuits filed in Maine, Missouri, Oklahoma, Michigan, and I believe Washington State as well. We have decisions striking down those residency requirements in at least 3 of those states. The federal court in Maine said, Maine, you can't do this. You can't limit your market just to residents. It violates the Dormant Commerce Clause. Same answer, just at the preliminary injunction stage in Michigan, same answer in Missouri. Oklahoma had a weird reason for getting rid of the case. And so those are test cases, and they're coming out for the way I've predicted. The courts are saying this violates the Dormant Commerce Clause. The next step would be somebody pushing to sell across state lines. That's a harder test because I think for a variety of reasons, federal judges might be a little bit leery about saying, state of Massachusetts, you have to let in Oregon product. The optics of that are a little bit different. The fashioning, the remedy is a little bit different. But yeah, lots of different ways that you could test these state restrictions on bringing product across state lines or investing across state lines.
So if somebody were to decide to challenge this, a licensee wanted to challenge this particular issue, would they be better to go to federal court or state court? Doesn't matter.
Oddly enough, you're probably better going to federal court. And each of these cases has actually been, that I mentioned, has been litigated in the federal court. Might seem strange because it's a federal that bans this, but it's also a federal constitutional principle that you would be invoking. And you might worry that a state judge, that forum selection is always an important issue in litigation. You might worry that a state judge is going to sympathize with state lawmakers and say, hey, they wanted to keep all the benefits of legalization and reserve those just for state residents. They didn't want outsiders making a profit off this. They didn't want outsiders taking some of the jobs. So a state judge might be elected, might be reluctant to invalidate a state restriction on interstate commerce. I think a federal judge may not be so hesitant.
Interesting.
In a couple scenarios David and I talked about earlier, one was I see this being a 3 to 5 year process. If you're going to invite, say, the press or the police to join you, you're going to ship it or drive it over a state line, arrest me, you're going to need a legal fund. You're going to get federally indicted at the time. It's going to take 3 to 5 years of appeals. And if you win, you may be the person, maybe at the Supreme Court, that gets this done. David thinks it would all be a much quicker process, kind of pre-trial motions. What do you think how would it break down on timing and money?
Yeah, it does take time. So this is all assuming no federal legalization, because I think that'll speed the process up dramatically. But it will take time because like that Maine lawsuit is just now going to the federal appeals court. One of the parties, the party challenging the residency requirement, won in the district court. The suit was started more than a year ago, I think, at this point. Just now getting to the appeals court. The appeals court has agreed we should stay the injunction, which means you get to keep your residency requirement, Maine, until we can rule on this issue and decide whether or not this is unconstitutional.
Really?
Yeah, so 2 to 3 years is probably the amount of time it would take to get kind of a higher court to rule on it. Maybe not the Supreme Court, but at least a federal appeals court to rule on it. You can get those preliminary injunctions and so on, and maybe that's helpful. But what you really want is sort of a precedent from an appellate court sort of validating this position. I think that sends a much stronger signal. And you wouldn't necessarily, to sort of Curt's scenario where you've got a patient who says, arrest me, you wouldn't necessarily have to do that. There's a famous old Supreme Court case, not that old, but Gonzalez versus Raich. The Supreme Court said, hey, Congress, you can criminalize intrastate activity, not just interstate activity. That was actually brought by a couple of women who were participating in Prop 215 out there. They asked the court for a declaration, a declaratory judgment, basically a statement from the court saying to the Attorney General of the United States, the application of the Controlled Substances Act to purely intrastate activities is unconstitutional. It took years and years to get to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said no, ultimately, but you don't necessarily have to be arrested to bring one of these actions. You could seek a declaratory judgment as long as you had a reasonable chance that you're going to be facing some sort of prosecution, probably from the state, because you want to challenge state law, not federal. But if you had that reasonable probability, you could seek a declaratory judgment, an injunction to block the state from discriminating against you because you're an outsider.
My recollection was that it was the Butte County Sheriffs and the DEA that raided Angel Rach's home, I thought in 2002. That sound right?
I think that's about right.
Yeah.
So that's what sort of triggered it. And so they, of course, they had an interest going forward. They wanted to know, hey, can we recreate this grow? And there were a couple of other patients that glommed onto that. And they sought that declaratory judgment. But Supreme Court didn't get around to ruling on that, given a final ruling until 2005. So a 3-year time period. If you want to get all the way to the Supreme Court, that may be how long it takes.
Right. That actually, from my limited understanding, I'm not an attorney, but to get up to the Supreme Court, 3 years is kind of quick.
Yeah, unless it's something involving some emergency action, or presidential action, that they're going to take their time with these things. They want the lower courts to.
So if a licensee would need to initiate this, right? Because I could see two ways this could happen. One is the licensee says, I'm going to import it. And we'll talk about that on one of our panels, because I've got this great scheme. I got my hat, my dark glasses, and tomorrow we're going to start importing weed from the West Coast.
There he is. All of the media follow you.
Here we are. So it seems to me there's two ways to initiate this. One way is you bring it in and wait for the feds to do something, and the other one is you say, I want to do this, and I'm suing you to get a declaration that says you can't stop me from doing it. What would? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, that's correct. I don't know if it's the feds you want to worry about. I think, again, to my mind, the big barrier to importation and exportation is the states. Yeah, Massachusetts says don't import the stuff. Colorado says don't import the stuff. Yep. So you really want to challenge state law. So you want to get some state. You would want to be arrested if you would ever want that to happen. You want to be arrested by the state authority and then challenge their law. Their ban on importation, say, hey, this violates the Dormant Commerce Clause. You're letting all these other people grow and sell the drug. You're discriminating against me because I grew it out of state, and that's unconstitutional. You'd want to do it that way, but the alternative and the safer route is to seek that declaration, and that's kind of what these out-of-state companies or investors that want to own cannabis businesses in other states, they're in a safer posture there. I think that's why those lawsuits have been brought first, because they can go to the state and say, we're just applying for a license. The state says, you can't, you're an outsider, you're not a resident. And then you can sue the state and say, this violates the Constitution, without risking criminal penalties.
So Curt, take that saw blade out of the banana nut bread you were making for me. I don't think I'm going to need it. We'll challenge it in advance.
Yeah, we should do this all in advance before getting arrested. We should get all the paperwork ready before you get on the airplane.
And don't bake any weed into that loaf.
We've always, the situations we're throwing at you, Professor, have always been licensees. For those people who don't have a license, an illicit grower takes a minivan across country from Emerald Triangle to New York City, boom, he's arrested. He should not just say, I invoke the dormant competency clause of the Constitution. I invoke the door. That's not going to cut it, right?
That's right. So in that instance, the state would say, with the Dormant Commerce Clause at its core, it bars geographic discrimination. So it says, New York State, you can't treat outside business people different than inside business people. You can't give those insiders a regulatory leg up. But all of the states that have legalized cannabis, they continue to ban the black market, whether it's the in-state black market or the out-of-state black market. So they'd say to that Emerald or Emerald Triangle grower, hey, we're treating you just like we would treat the guy in-state that's doing this without a license. And so there'd be no Dormant Commerce Clause challenge to bring there.
Wanted to clarify that for some of our viewers.
Yeah.
Who pull out their cell phone and show the police our show as they're getting arrested.
Yeah, just as a disclaimer, none of this is legal advice, either for you or for your viewers, of course. But these are my sort of prognostications about how the law would shake out here.
So I understand we've got a lot of people in the chat room. Thanks for joining us. It's 4:20 on the East Coast, and most of you know what that means. Even though Jimmy's not with us today, he's actually in the YouTube chat room monitoring and texting me with questions that people have. So we're going to take our standard break. We're going to be right back. Don't go away. Enjoy the 4:20 break, and we'll see you back in a few minutes here in the Green Rush.
Yeah, this is a tune that I wrote back in 19... I've forgotten. We had a saying in our old band, one of my first bands in 1966 or so. What are you going to do tonight? Oh, just, like every other night, just going to lay around the shanty and put a good buzz on. Gonna sit down in the kitchen, fix me something good to eat. Make my head a little high, make the whole day complete. Gonna lay around the shanty, oh mama, and put a good buzz on. Pass it to me, baby, pass it to me slow. We'll take time out to smile a little before you let her go. We're gonna lay around the shanty, oh mama, and put a good buzz on. You're on something. Go ahead. Rick Brodsky, everybody. Nothing to do and there's always room for more. Fill it, light it, shut up and close that door, baby. We're gonna lay around the shanty, mama, and put a good buzz on. Take it, okay. Prohibition never works, it's time to realize it. It grows in my backyard, it's time to legalize it. We're gonna lay around the shanty, mama, and put a good buzz on. I'm gonna sit down in my rented car, I'm gonna jam it into drive. Gonna head on out and play at WSCA with Sean. I'm glad I'm alive. We're gonna lay around the shanty, mama, and put a good buzz on every night and day. We're gonna lay around the shanty, mama, and put a good buzz on.
Pro Cannabis Media programming and PCM TV is supported by Revolutionary Clinics, Massachusetts' #1 medical dispensary where the patient comes first, and by Salient Systems for Video Surveillance. You've got regulations, Salient has solutions for your security needs. And by Accounting Buds, your #1 CPA specialist for the cannabis industry. And by Artery Pay, easy, cheap, fun, and legal, just like cannabis should be.
And we're back. Thanks for sticking with us. It's Friday afternoon here on the Green Rush Show on Pro Cannabis Media. We're kind of jump usually from about 4:26 or so when we're done with the break till 4:30. We just fill in. But this is such an exciting topic. We're bringing in the 4:30 panelists now. We're very happy to have with us Stephen Hoffman, who's the chairman of the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, and Scott Moskol, who co-leads the cannabis practice at Burns & Levinson, one of the leading law firms in the Boston area. So I'm going to give them a moment just to introduce themselves, and then we're going to get back into it with Professor Mikos. Stephen, you want to start?
Sure. I think you've already introduced me, David, but thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm Steve Hoffman. I'm the chairman of the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. I've been in my job since September 1st of 2017, and it's been quite a ride to see how much we've accomplished over the last 4 years. There are now 317 operational marijuana establishments in the state, including over 150 retailers. We will, in calendar year 21, do approximately $1.3 billion of business, retail business in the adult use space. So the industry is taking off in Massachusetts. I think we still have a long ways to go, and we're excited about the future. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Great, and thank you as well for allowing me to join this group. My name is Scott Moskol. Like David mentioned, I co-run our cannabis practice at Burns & Levinson. We've been working with cannabis clients since 2013, mostly on the corporate and finance side, as well as obviously regulatory, because you have to know the regulations in order to do a transaction in any state in this country. And basically our practice is nationwide, but besides representing operators, including some top MSOs, we also represent a lot of banks and credit unions, as well as lenders, venture capital funds, PE funds in this space. So thank you for inviting me and looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Curt, you want to pick up? You want me to go?
Sure, I'll go. So, Steve, in the first 20 minutes, we have Professor Mikos telling us a licensed operator, if it got to the point of crossing a state line due to the dormancy clause, may actually be legal. You're in charge of mass licensing. You have I have my lawyer here. It was Burns & Levinson. I want to test this. What would you say if they came to you first with this idea as a licensee in Massachusetts about either importing or exporting cannabis?
Well, first thing I'd say is it's a violation of our regulations. Second of all, I would say as a regulator, I'm not a lawmaker, and my job and the commission's job is to enforce the law. And so if the law changes, or if the law is challenged, or our regulations are challenged, and that's the ruling, we would adhere to it. So I don't really have an opinion on what should happen. Well, I do have a personal opinion. I think it would be a bad idea for the industry in Massachusetts, but legally, as I said, we enforce the law. And right now our regulations are that you cannot cross state lines, both coming into the state or coming out of the state. And we enforce those regulations.
You just said, though, it'd be a bad idea in your own personal opinion. Do you want to expound on that?
Yeah, I took this job because I really believed in the objectives of the law of Question 4 and the subsequent legislation that created our commission. And if you read that, the legislation was very explicit. They wanted to create a diverse industry. They wanted to create an industry that created room for smaller players. They wanted to create an industry that created room for farming in Massachusetts, particularly small farmers and co-ops. They absolutely wanted to ensure that the industry provided an opportunity for participation by those that were harmed by marijuana prohibition. All those things, in my opinion, would be at risk if interstate commerce was allowed. And I support all of the objectives of the law, as I said a few seconds ago. And interstate commerce, to me, would be deleterious to every one of those specific objectives that was part of the legislation.
And I have to agree with that. I mean, the referendum for one of its primary focuses was establishing this industry for the benefit of those who have been harmed by the war against prohibition, but also for minority social justice, social equity. And, I do think that if the Dormant Commerce Clause were to allow interstate commerce in the cannabis industry, essentially Massachusetts would be flooded by all the cannabis from the Emerald Triangle. And I think that would put a lot of social equity EA applicants who have run their business for a period of time at risk, because they're not going to be able to stand up to the big boys. And I don't necessarily think that that's a good idea. As much as I'm a capitalist, I do think that we have a social contract. Referendum 4 is an example of that. And, we do need, I think the state does have a valid reason, whether it's public safety or whatnot, in order to prevent that to happen.
So, I'm sorry, Commissioner, you look.
No, go ahead, David.
So I'm going to take an opposing view, and if, as it stands now, it's the larger players in Massachusetts that are vertically integrated, generally speaking, who grow their own, process it, and sell it at retail. Many of the independent retailers tend to be the smaller players. So if you've got a smaller player who now has to compete with the large players who have the full margin, getting interstate commerce would likely hurt the local growers.
Right.
But I think it might actually help the local product manufacturers and local retailers, because it may place them on more equitable footing against some of the bigger growers or the fully integrated growers.
Yeah, I disagree with that, David. I mean, I think I understand your point, and I think there's validity to it. But why I disagree is that we have Scott's used my line when he said he's a capitalist. I'm a capitalist too, and I believe in competition and free enterprise. And one of the things we've done in Massachusetts is we said we're not going to put caps on the number of licenses we're going to issue. We have caps on the number of licenses any one individual or entity can control, but there are no caps on the total number of licenses. And if you look at the licenses we've issued to date, as well as what's in our licensing queue, there's going to be enormous competition in terms of cultivators competing to sell to manufacturers competing to sell to retailers. I think we have a ton of competition, and we will continue to have more competition in the state that will not allow the big players to dominate the market. I just think it's an efficient market, and there's plenty of room for small players. You did make one point that I absolutely agree with, which is that there's no debate to the fact that farmers and cultivators in Massachusetts would be devastated by interstate commerce. You just can't debate that fact, in my opinion.
And I agree with that. I mean, with respect to the smaller growers in the state, many of them have now taken to sort of the craft beer concepts, the craft cannabis concept. And so they are carving out their own particular niche in order to compete. And I'll agree with the commission. That's capitalism at its best, right? Trying to figure out where you can make the best margin in the business and to adapt and to evolve.
So what I was going to say, David, if I could, you asked, the original question was, what did I think about Professor Mikos' paper? And I just wanted to make a couple other comments again without commenting on the legal argument. One is, he pointed out the Cole memorandum and said that's not a basis, at least not a legal basis to forestall interstate commerce. That might or might not be true, but it's certainly a policy decision that we made and will defend, that we don't want to set our licensees up to be, in trouble with the feds. I guess I don't have, that's not particularly eloquent, I apologize. But the Cole Memorandum was pretty clear on the topic of interstate commerce. And I'll further point out that the Cole Memorandum was rescinded, I believe, in 2018 by Jeff Sessions, either 2018 or 2019. I think it was 2018. It was rescinded by then Attorney General Sessions. And what Sessions said is, he said, I'm going to let my individual U.S. state attorneys determine what their policy will be with respect to legalized marijuana in the states that have legalized. At that point, U.S. Attorney Lelling, who was the U.S. Attorney of Massachusetts at that point in time, was pushed pretty hard by the industry, including people like David, to say, okay, what are you going to do? And what Lelling articulated was essentially a reinstatement of the Cole Memorandum, the things that the Cole Memorandum prohibited in terms of underage consumption, in terms of criminal money coming into finance businesses, and particularly interstate commerce, all were articulated by Lelling as reasons that he might intervene in the industry. And so we think there's a strong policy reason for listening to the Cole Memorandum, even if there's not kind of a legally binding reason to do so, as you argue. There's certainly a good policy reason to do so, in my opinion.
And just piggybacking off that, I agree. May not be the law of the land per se, but don't forget, so FinCEN issued its memorandum in 2014 detailing somewhat how banks and credit unions can take cannabis deposits and deal with the money laundering issue. In that part of that calculus is the Cole Memorandum factors, the prosecutorial priorities. So to a certain extent, maybe one could argue that the Cole Memorandum isn't necessarily policy of the Department of Justice as a whole, but in terms of the Department of Treasury, it still remains really important with respect to ensuring that money laundering isn't going on. And so it isn't necessarily fully rescinded in totally throughout the country.
Professor, do you want to respond to that? Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, just a couple of points on background. I mean, one, if you read the Cole Memoranda, I don't think it says no interstate commerce, period. I think it raises a concern about where it says diversion across state lines.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think what Jim Cole had in mind with that was you're in Colorado and you're shipping it over to Nebraska, a state that doesn't allow it. I think that raises a different set of concerns, and you could see why the DOJ might be interested in intervening in that case. But it's not like a blanket prohibition or a statement against all interstate commerce. I mean,
right, but also you have to remember, like, let's just take New England for example, right? So Mass and Maine have adult use and medicinal. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire have only, Mass and Maine adult use. The other states besides Vermont, medicinal only. Vermont technically has legalized adult use, but not for commercial sales. So, you can't necessarily legally, right, under the Cole Memorandum, technically you can't necessarily take adult use cannabis and cross the border to New Hampshire because adult use is not allowed there.
Sure, that would be a different form of diversion. I think that the bigger problem with relying so much on the DOJ is that the court has repeatedly said, Congress and Congress alone can turn off that anti-discrimination default rule of the Dormant Commerce Clause. So even if the Attorney General tomorrow came out and said, I sanction what you're doing, Massachusetts, I agree with you fully, and discriminate all you want in interstate commerce in not just cannabis, but hey, beer and tobacco and everything else. The DOJ has no power to turn off that Dormant Commerce Clause. So I think that's a more fundamental problem.
What the Justice Department does have the ability to do, though, is take a legal business in the state of Massachusetts and say, well, it's in violation of federal law. And it doesn't seem to me to be bad policy. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry for the double neck. It seems to be good policy to do as little to poke the bear as possible. I will also say, my job, as I said, as a regulator, I don't make law, I enforce the law, and I'm a state employee. So my job is to enforce Massachusetts law. The law, this is one of the reasons we came to the conclusion about interstate commerce. The law has a clause in it, which I found amazing when I first started, which is, quote, the commission shall establish separate regulations for Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, period. When I first started, it took me a month or two to figure out what they were talking about. And because they didn't give us any guidance, they just said separate regulations. It turns out, of course, that what they were concerned about is the transport of product across federal water between the mainland and the two islands. And to me, that is a strong indication that the intent of the legislation was to keep this within the state of Massachusetts, to not cross federal boundaries, to not cross state boundaries. Now, again, that we made a policy decision. I will defend the policy decision, but as I said, if a court overrules a policy decision, we'll implement the new laws. But I will absolutely defend the policy decision.
And
I just want to jump in real quick, Scott, and then I'm going to come right back to you. But we've been, Beau Whitney has joined us, and he's been sitting there patiently and quietly. So I want to introduce Beau to the audience. Beau Whitney is probably one of the leading economists in the cannabis space. We're thrilled to have him have us. Scott, I'm going to give it back to you, but Beau, feel free to just jump right into the discussion once Scott makes the comment.
I'll just, and because myself and the commission will just go on and on. So please just jump in. But looking at your law review article, Professor, one of the things it did discuss is that perhaps in a carve out, let's say for the Dormant Commerce Clause, is public safety, public health, and there are components of the regulations that do promote that in many different ways. And I'm not just talking about like packaging regulations per se, but, for example, the regulations provide you have to utilize certain lighting for energy conservation. You have to have an energy conservation plan, which is for the public safety because of environmental concerns. It prescribes that you have to have minimum insurance for certain things. I mean, even something like that is certainly something for the public safety. And if you are having product produced elsewhere, stormed into here, perhaps those public safety covenants or provisions in the regs are being tripped. And I mean, those are just a couple that come to mind. I'm sure the commissioner can rattle off like 10 off the top of his head. But it's more than just, people, even like the testing, right? So not all states have the same testing requirements for cannabis. Some allow different types of heavy metals. Now, granted, I guess you could come to a uniform set of standards, but that would probably take Congress longer than it would to pass something so simple as the Safe Banking Act. So I'll just leave my political commentary there.
I thought the role of CANRA was to establish those state by state common sets of rules so that when the topic of interstate commerce comes up, then there would be an infrastructure already in place in order to support that. And so, but I haven't seen much results yet out of CANRA in terms of the harmonization of rules and regulations to support cross-border traffic.
I think CANRA is a great organization, and our executive director is part of it. And I think that, it's a wonderful forum for states to learn from one another, share best practice. And so I support it completely. That being said, CANRA's not going to tell the state of Massachusetts what to do with our regulations. We're certainly willing to learn from other states, and to the extent that there's some benefits of getting in line with other states, we'll do so. But I don't view CANRA as an organization that's going to enforce consistency of regulations across states. That's taking away our prerogative, and that I don't believe will happen.
No, I'm not saying CANRA as an enforcement tool, but more as a way in which to educate from state to state and then drive towards harmonization on packaging, on testing, and all these other protocols in preparation in the run-up of either full federal legalization or with some type of interstate commerce pack or what have you.
Yeah, it's possible, and I agree with you. It's a very useful body. You talked about federal legalization, and that was the other thing I would love to hear, Professor, your perspective on, because in your paper you talked about this might all be moot if there's federal legalization. I guess I want to hear a couple of things from you, if you wouldn't mind. One is, they've been talking about federal legalization for a long time. I do not have a crystal ball, but I do see how dysfunctional Congress is, as we all do, I think. So I'm not sure that it's imminent, but let's say it happens. There's, to me, a lot of different ways that it could be legalized. And I don't think it's a lay down that it's just going to become a nationally regulated national market kind of phenomenon. As a matter of fact, I have argued with our state's federal delegation that would be a bad thing. And that another path towards legalization potentially is just tell the states, if you want to do it, do it. You know, here are the guidelines you have to follow, do it, but we're not going to interfere, nor are we going to tell you that you have to allow for interstate commerce. Now, again, I have no idea what or if Congress is going to do anything, but I don't think legalization is just, you know, kind of one size fits all. There's a couple of different paths that it could go down. So I'm very interested in your thoughts on that, Professor.
Yeah, one thing I want to get out clearly is that, you know, hopefully it's clear from the papers. I'm worried about interstate commerce.
No, I saw that.
Oh, yes.
A lot of the same reasons. I don't think we want to go down that route, at least in the short term. So I'm kind of, you know, the bringer of bad news, but I'm not the champion of this. I'm not saying, hey, this is
well, can we blame you anyway?
do it.
And Commissioner Hoffman and I did not. Sorry, go ahead.
But I would say, you know, if there's federal legalization, I wouldn't say this is moot. Instead, I'd say this is settled. You can't enforce those. I mean, you can, but they're going to get shot down by court. All those restrictions on interstate commerce. The moment Congress legalizes, the only way to stop that, the Dormant Commerce Clause, the only way to stop that is through crystal clear congressional legislation that says to the courts, don't apply the Dormant Commerce Clause.
No, I agree with that.
So even something like, you know, there are other ways to do this. I agree. Congress, you know, it's not up to the task. Federal agencies not up to the task of regulating this. You guys at the state have a lot more experience, a lot more regulations on the books. It would take a while for the federal government to sort of catch up. But to turn off that Dormant Commerce Clause, you need very clear language. It wouldn't be enough for Congress to pass something like, you know, the States Act. That's another proposal where Congress says federally legal, but, you know, states, you handle it. Dormant Commerce Clause would still come in and tell the states, if you allow this, if you allow people to grow and sell it, you can't discriminate because they're based in another state.
No, I get that. By the way, Professor, I do get that you were raising a concern. You weren't advocating. As a matter of fact, you were the opposite. So I respect that and appreciate that. But I think I just heard you say, well, it might be hard. It is doable if the legislation is written correctly. It's doable to enforce a ban on interstate commerce if this was federally legalized. I think I heard you say that. Maybe
yes.
A long shot, but it's doable.
No, it's doable. And I think there's, you know, I think you can, you know, and to the extent that state regulators help to push in this direction, I think there's a strong case to be made to Congress to turn off this Dormant Commerce Clause, at least for a period of years, you know, this transition period. And actually in a piece with Scott Bloomberg, who's a law professor at the University of Maine, we spell out exactly how Congress could do that. There's legislative language you could borrow from insurance. That's, you know, a very similar market, it turns out, to cannabis. 70 years ago, the Supreme Court threw everyone a curveball. Before that period, before 1945, the Supreme Court said insurance isn't commerce, so it's not subject to the Dormant Commerce Clause. And then the Supreme Court did an about face. Companies started challenging those state laws that said you can't be an out-of-state insurance company and sell insurance here. Created chaos. Congress stepped in, the Karen Ferguson Act, and said, we suspend the Dormant Commerce Clause. That's the language you would need to use. And no federal proposal right now for this CAOA or the CAOA, Cannabis Opportunity Administration Act. It's hard to get the acronym down. It doesn't have language that would do that. The States Act doesn't have language that would do that. The MORE Act doesn't. I think this has kind of been an oversight, just an accident by Congress. There's so much language in there saying, hey, we want to preserve the states and help them out, but they don't realize that the moment you legalize this federally, you activate this Dormant Commerce Clause and you wreak havoc with the states.
I have a question, Professor. So I totally agree with respect to adult use that, you know, the Dormant Commerce Clause is going to, you know, take down those barriers. Now, my question is, I have no idea what the answer is. I don't know if you've looked into this, but I'm curious, what about the medicinal market? Because to me, that's more pharmaceutical. right? I mean, if it is fully legalized, let's say, I mean, cannabis is a form of medicine for many, many people, including myself. Do you think there's a public safety exception there, and how the medicinal market might be treated or governed, and whether the dormant clause could override that? And again, I don't know the answer. I haven't, just something that came to me as a question.
Yeah, so it's hard, and it goes back to your earlier point that the Dormant Commerce Clause will give a state a chance to justify its regulations. So if Massachusetts can come up with a legitimate reason for discriminating against outsiders, it's not protectionism, it's not saving jobs for locals, even for locals of disproportionately impacted communities. It's not that, it's public health and safety. And if discrimination is absolutely the only way you can do that, the state can win. It can sustain its regulations. It's just really, really tough to do that. The court might say things like, you're worried about testing. Well, apply Massachusetts testing requirements to out-of-state product. Don't just say you can't sell that Oregon stuff here. Just subject it to the same testing. Require them to use, testing that complies with Massachusetts law. That it's just tough once you get into that corner. Once the Dormant Commerce Clause applies, it's tough to justify kind of blatant state restrictions against outsiders.
Let me stoke the fire here and bring Beau in, and I'm gonna poke and prod. I hear a lot of state protectionism talk from Steve and Scott about protecting our farmers, protecting our manufacturers. But at what price to the consumer, Beau? And being an economics guy, I think the price for a pound in Emerald Triangle, $700-800 in Mass indoor is $4,200. And there's your arbitrage of why so many people want this thing to happen. Economically speaking, would it be a boon or a bust for, say, a Massachusetts with these differences? At what price is the consumer paying for this Massachusetts cannabis that now it can't come in and bring the prices down for consumers? What would you think would happen, Beau?
Well, initially the prices would go down, but they're set to go down anyway as markets mature and saturate. It's just how far do they go down? I think by having a national distribution or national supply system, it would actually raise prices coming out of California and Oregon, for example, on the wholesale side, while lowering the prices until there is an established equilibrium. And so I think that's how I view it. I mean, that's why there's a big push in Oregon and California and elsewhere on the West Coast to establish these trade relations with the East Coast, because it gives a market opportunity that they don't currently have. Now, in California and Oregon right now, there's a supply surplus. So I would tend to disagree with the unlimited license hypothesis that was presented earlier, because in these siloed markets, there's only so much demand, and until it's not economically viable. But once you open up that market and open it up to the entire domestic demand in the US, then that risk of saturation and further price declines, commoditization, et cetera, doesn't necessarily exist as much unless you start licensing in Massachusetts to support the US market, and then New Jersey licenses on the cultivation side to supply the entire market. That's when there becomes these market distortions. But overall, it would be good for consumers because of lower prices. There would be an increase of demand because of the demand elasticity. It would also, with lower prices, would drive out and be more competitive relative to illicit market. So you'd be able to convert more consumers over to the legal market relative to the illicit market. And so that's where the public safety factor comes in as well. So you've got a lot of benefits associated with opening up interstate commerce to cannabis suppliers, especially from west to east.
So I guess the roll-off question to Scott and Steve would be, and Professor mentioned this earlier in the show, avocados, oranges from other states. Why do we have to protect the cannabis farmer as opposed to our apple farmers when we import apples if we do get legalization? Why the barrier? You sound like capitalists, but state-centric capitalists, not full-on capitalists. So go ahead.
Go ahead, Scott, if you want to go first. I'm happy to go first. I was being polite, I was not
Okay.
Trying to dodge the question. I was being polite, which I know is out of character. So,
Go ahead. You want to go?
I think Massachusetts has some specific policy objectives that are certainly subject to debate, but there are specific policy objectives. They are trying to encourage small cultivators, particularly outdoor cultivation. I respect that. You can disagree with that as an objective, but I respect that. It's a very explicit objective of the law. I think that as much as the law is focused on farming, though, there are other objectives as well that would be substantially threatened by interstate commerce, and those are really important. I mean, the idea that, again, people that were harmed by marijuana prohibition can be full participants in this industry. We're doing everything we can to help those people get into the industry, and I'm very proud of the progress we've made, although we have a long ways to go. But they're struggling. They're having a hard time raising capital. They're having a hard time getting through the municipal bureaucracy to get a host community agreement signed before they can even apply to my commission for a license. Those are in my opinion, those are worthwhile social objectives. And we have cultivated or developed a set of regulations that are, unashamedly, explicitly attempting to incent those outcomes. I support those outcomes personally. I guess I said I wouldn't have taken this job had I not, or did I not? And that's the way we built our regulations. People can absolutely disagree with policy. I mean, look, I've lived for 4 years with the fact that question 4 passed by 53% in favor, 47% opposed. There's a significant percentage of the state that doesn't like the law, some because they don't like marijuana, some because of the concerns like you raised, Curt. That's democracy. The law is the law. My job is to uphold the law. And as I said, I would not take this job, or would not have taken this job, unless I supported the objectives of the law. And I think the intended outcomes are desirable.
And just to kind of coincide with that, I mean, the war against marijuana started, it has its roots in racism. I mean, that's a fact. And to the extent, if the national legislation that legalized the end of prohibition, descheduled, whatever we're going to do, also had a component in which, social equity, social justice, whatever you want to, EA, economic empowerment, if that was a consistently implemented across the country, then, maybe I would have a different perspective of the state's rights and the state's needs. But, the referendum, I mean, again, referendum 4 did specifically carve out this necessity, right, for making sure the industry was available, and there were certain benefits given to people who were affected by the war on drugs, or war on marijuana. And so to me, that's the distinction with pure capitalism.
Professor, what do you think of that? I use the apple example. We grow apples here in Massachusetts. We import them as well. Where does social equity and economic empowerment candidates fit in the dormancy clause if this kind of moves forward? Can a state say, hey, look, those higher prices and things you're seeing are necessary for these applicants and what we're building and in our referendums and our laws?
Yeah, it would be an argument I urge Stephen to push to a court if challenged on this. I don't know if it would win, though. The social equity applicants or social equity licensees, they're really the ones who are going to be hit hardest, I think, interstate commerce. In part because this national market in interstate commerce is going to invite a lot of consolidation in the industry. So now you're going to be the minority-owned businesses are going to be less well capitalized, even with access to banking compared to a lot of other firms. It's going to be an uphill battle against the behemoths, them, and I doubt they'd survive. But they're going to be hit in another way. And one of the things some states have done is they've tried to carve out a special set of licenses. They restrict the number of licenses. They'll say, here are some that we're going to designate for these communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. They can't award them based on race because that would violate the Equal Protection Clause. Instead, what they've done is they've awarded these based on geography. They said, here are some communities in our state where the arrest rates were 5 times higher than they were in other states. And we're going to give residents from these communities more of these special licenses. You can't do that if you can't discriminate based on geography. And so that class of licensing, I think, is going to dry up. Maybe you can tell a court, hey, we've got a special reason for doing this. You know, this community was disproportionately impacted. I don't know if the court would buy that, though.
We've given those licenses, as you know, Professor. We've given exclusivity to social equity and economic empowerment applicants for several categories of licenses, delivery as well as social consumption. Although social consumption, unfortunately, is still a theory until there's a way for cities and towns to opt in. But nonetheless, your point about geography, I understand. What we've done is we've said there are multiple criteria that you need to meet. You don't need to meet all of them. You need to meet 2 out of 4. One of those 4 criteria is, residency in a disproportionately impacted areas. Others have to do with things like historical arrests in your family or yourself, income. So we've tried to make it so it's not purely discrimination based upon geography. There are other, what we think are strong policy reasons that we've set criteria up. What's your thought on that? Because again, geography is one criteria, but you can actually meet the other two of the other 3 criteria that have nothing to do with geography and still qualify for one of these licenses.
It's smart to have that, I think, as sort of an addendum or additional criteria. I think a court would probably still say, going forward, if a court said the Dormant Commerce Clause applies, you can't use geography at all. Or maybe what you have to do is you have to say, all right, we'll accept applicants who live in communities in other states that meet the same criteria, which maybe that's not appealing to Massachusetts. Maybe you don't want to be giving out these licenses to some
I'm laughing just because
Idaho,
one of the other things the legislature did to us is say we had to ensure that people from disproportionately impacted communities were full participants in the industry. They did not define what a disproportionately impacted community was. We've gone through several rounds of analysis to try to define that, and I'm just smiling because God knows if other states have to go through the process as well.
Oh yeah. There's oftentimes those tough questions are foisted onto the regulators rather than taken on by the lawmakers. But you could continue to use those other criteria, but it might mean, hey, did you have a family member who was arrested in the past?
Right. Well, that's one of the criteria.
Right. But it may be, all right, I'm from Idaho and I had a family member who was arrested.
I understand your point.
Where's my license?
I don't wish this definitional issue of what constitutes disproportionately impacted community on any other state. That's all.
Yeah. Fair enough.
I'm going to jump in, folks. It's 5 o'clock. We got to take our top of the hour break. Stick with us. We're going to be right back here in the Green Rush.
So I think there's one very important difference between me and most of my team members and other cannabis accounting firms, especially outsourced cannabis accounting firms. With a lot of the other firms, you're going to find bookkeepers or folks that were accountants for their entire career, but they were junior accountants. I've spent most of my career alongside CFOs at public companies with thousands of employees, public companies. So much of my career wasn't spent in the debits and credits. It was spent with the CFO, CEO, COO of large public companies, working on strategy, working on planning and big initiatives, working on projects such as mergers and integrations. So that high level experience, along with being able to do the debits and credits and having members of my team that also have fairly senior experience and also members of the team that are junior and can do the bookkeeping at a little bit lower cost than some of the people with the experience, gives our clients a much broader depth of experience than a lot of the other firms where you're hiring someone that is just a bookkeeper and can't help with the strategy side of it, or someone that's been an executive for a long time and can only help with the strategy, but can't help with the hands-on.
Pro Cannabis Media programming and PCM TV is supported by Revolutionary Clinics, Massachusetts' #1 medical dispensary where the patient comes first, and by Salient Systems for Video Surveillance. You've got regulations, Salient has solutions for your security needs. And by Accounting Buds, your #1 CPA specialist for the cannabis industry. And by Artery Pay, easy, cheap, fun, and legal, just like cannabis should be.
Difference is building a solution for that individual, not just a custom, here's a box, here's a video, here's how you make your VMS. We custom design and custom build every situation for exactly what the customer needs. And we keep the costs low. We have multiple tiers, as far as what you're looking at on the cost side of things. If you want a one-time, where you just pay one initial cost, we have that. If you want to maintain your system and have the highest protection and highest capabilities and highest upgrades at all times, we have different plans for you. But we scale it so it's scalable and affordable 100%.
Pro Cannabis Media programming and PCM TV is supported by Revolutionary Clinics, Massachusetts' #1 medical dispensary where the patient comes first, and by Salient Systems for Video Surveillance. You've got regulations, Salient has solutions for your security needs. And by Accounting Buds, your #1 CPA specialist for the cannabis industry. And by Artery Pay, easy, cheap, fun, and legal, just like cannabis should be.
Hey, and we're back here at the Friday afternoon in the Green Rush. Thanks for sticking with us. We are now going into our next panel. I want to introduce Adam Smith, referred to us by Beau Whitney. Thanks, Beau, for that. And David Holland. I'm going to let them introduce themselves rather than me take the thunder away. Let's start with David.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for this honor to be part of this panel here. I'm a litigation attorney in New York with the longstanding interest and advocacy in this space. I'm the head of Empire State NORML, which is New York's chapter of the National Organization for Reform Marijuana Laws. I'm a co-founder of the New York City and the Hudson Valley Cannabis Industry Associations. Thank you for letting me be here today.
Okay. Adam?
Hi, I'm Adam Smith. Forgive me, I'm working off my phone. I'm having an audio problem on my computer. So if you can bear with the video. I am the founder and president of the Alliance for Sensible Markets, and we are specifically concerned with bringing about interstate commerce prior to federal legalization. And I think it addresses a lot of the issues that you've been talking about on the last segment.
Right. So the last segment we had a couple of guests who were very much looking to hold back the tide of interstate commerce in order to protect the local market. Now we're going to have, at least Adam is going to start to talk about why we should move forward with it. New York is a big state, but if you travel through upstate New York, you'll find it's like going through rural mid-America. It is a much different world than downstate is. And when people think of New York, they think of Manhattan. That's where David is, in that densely populated area that has a lot of cannabis activity that just went fully in the other direction. You can smoke out in the street. The police no longer, from what I understand, seem to care about it. And it's just passé. But now we're going to get another feel for what these folks think about Professor Mikos's paper. Kurt, you want to?
Yeah. So Adam, you're kind of going to be the professor's first true supporter on the sideline here. We've had a lot of state protectionism, and let's protect everybody, and no, let's not do that. And there are good reasons: social equity and economic empowerment, not just financial protection. Why are you a fan of the paper, and why do you want to see this before legalization?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly a fan of Professor Mikos's legal argument, and I'm trained as a lawyer, but have never practiced 35 years after taking the bar. So my legal advice is worth exactly what you're paying for it at the moment. But I think on the economic side, I think there's some important points that it really misses. First of all, there is no future in growing cannabis at scale in various parts of the country. There are parts of the country in which there is very well is going to be a future in growing cannabis. I believe that there is probably a future. There is almost certainly a future for locally grown craft cannabis anywhere that it's environmentally reasonable to do so. But what we've done with the siloed markets in many of the states that have siloed markets is we've really handed over the industry to a few large players who can afford to put in tens of millions of dollars into giant production factories that would not exist and that no one would have invested in absent these siloed markets, right? You would never, if someone said, go grow cannabis anywhere in the country you want to sell it nationally, you wouldn't pick New Jersey, almost certainly, right? I'm from New York, so I pick on New Jersey a little bit. At the same time, and in those states, right, in those consumer states that traditionally have always imported the vast majority of the cannabis that was sold there, right? Thousands of potential businesses in retail, distribution, delivery, product development, manufacturing, wellness, hospitality, all of these areas, most of which have far lower economic barriers to entry and capital requirements than large-scale cultivation, are stuck waiting years for a supply chain. They are then limited in their supply chain to very few choices. And out here on the West Coast in Oregon and Northern California, you have thousands of growers across legacy communities that have depended upon the economics of cannabis for generations, that have put everything on the line to go legal and do this right, that are now looking at an economic catastrophe from what looks from the outside like an oversupply problem, but it is actually a market access problem. If we had access to the markets that this region traditionally served, we would need every ounce of cannabis we could grow under current licensure, right? So that is the other half of or another part of the equity issue, the traditional market, which went from producers out here in the Pacific Northwest into consumer markets all over the country. What we're looking to do is to go to the Department of Justice to ask for clarification on what their stance would be if two legal or medical states decided to regulate trade between them. And Merrick Garland has said where the states are regulating, we're not going to get involved. And that's about all of the permission that any of the legal adult use markets have. On the medical side, you have the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment, which forbids DOJ from getting involved in state medical programs. And so we want to know if a state medical program in Delaware, for example, which has legal patients but very little access, said we're going to bring cannabis in from California or Oregon to provide for our patients, what would the Department of Justice do? And because this is an opt-in situation, it would allow states that want to protect their nascent production industries to do that. But it would allow states where it doesn't make sense to build an entire industry around production that will ultimately become non-competitive under federal legalization to get their industries going or to provide for their patients in a way that makes economic and environmental sense and is better for consumers.
Professor Mikos, what's the Justice Department say to that request?
They would demur on that request. Anytime you ask them, hey, can I do X, Y, and Z, they'll say, no thanks. So I'd be surprised if Merrick Garland actually responded to that, or one of the deputies actually responded to such a notion. But I think Adam is onto something here, which is that the claim that the federal government would somehow be bothered by interstate commerce in cannabis. As I mentioned before, I don't buy it. I don't think they see a difference between in-state and across state line sales. But certainly if both states that were involved in the transaction, the exporting state and the importing state, were okay with it, I think any pretense that the DOJ would object to that goes away. So I think there would be value maybe in that first step that Adam describes, which is getting two states together, getting Oregon together with Iowa or some new state down the line that legalizes medical cannabis that figures, hey, we can't grow this stuff. Other states have a head start on us. We're not going to have a cultivation market here, but we've got consumers that need the product and don't want to wait 3 years for the industry to develop. I think getting two states to agree to this, and they could plow ahead, or at least they could say, hey, if you want to try this, firms, go ahead and ship it. You're taking on the legal risk, but we're not going to stop you. then I think that the chances that the DOJ would actually intervene are slim to none.
So Professor, would it matter whether the states are contiguous or not?
It would make it a lot easier. You have to pass through Idaho, for example. That makes it tough. But if you had, if this were Oregon,
you can't even get hemp through Idaho.
That's why I chose. Yeah, that's why I chose. I know it's great that you put that out though.
That's when you put it on the roads, but right, contiguous states, it's very easy. So I'm gonna lay out my plan, and then I'm gonna be quiet, and I want to hear everybody's response to this. It would have been nice if I had done this with Hoffman still here. I got to make sure nobody can identify me. So here's what I plan on getting a medical license here in Massachusetts, because with a medical license, I'm protected under Rohrabacher. I'm going to fly out to California, find a licensed grower, buy product from that licensed grower, have it tested in California to the Massachusetts standards, put it on an airplane and fly it back. When it lands at Logan, I may actually invite the DEA and the FBI to meet me there, because if they have any problem, I'm going to explain to them that Rohrabacher keeps them from expending their resources, and I'm a medical operator. So I'm bringing it in under the medical license. And then once I have it in the warehouse in Massachusetts, we're allowed as a medical operator to convert a certain amount of that to rec use. So tell me, what am I doing wrong?
You're breaking state law.
Adam nailed it.
You're also outside the realm of what Rohrabacher allows.
Right. You're right. So the thing is that none of this happens politically until two governors decide to match up their systems, right? Otherwise you're breaking state law, right? And so, I appreciate the thought that the DOJ would demur, which is why we are attempting to get governors to ask this question, right? And specifically to get, on the medical side, to get clarity on what does Rohrabacher cover, right? And I would tell you that I'm pretty confident that Earl Blumenauer believes that Rohrabacher would, that his amendment would already cover interstate commerce, but it's going to have to be approved by the governors. It's going to have to leave one regulatory system and go into another regulatory system. So you need this. Yeah, that's the problem.
But the problem, under your scenario, though, the problem that you have, David, is that you've created, Rohrabacher really specifically pertains only to medical marijuana and only within one single state siloed operation. So to fly over from one side of the country to another, to then convert what's otherwise probably recreational use, but would qualify as compliant with the medical standards of Massachusetts, and fly it back and then claim it to be, while interstate commerce, effectively as good as what had it been grown in Massachusetts, that's going to defy pretty much every precept of state and federal law and put you into the problem. So you're not really in interstate commerce as much as you are operating outside of every legal structure, which there is a tolerance for right now with regard to Rohrabacher and the other things that have been out there as spending appropriation amendments.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, well, two things. One is that you could do this, and I agree with David and Adam. The fact that it's against state law means it's also not protected under Rohrabacher FAR.
Right.
The only quirk is that you could then say, well, the state law itself is invalid because it violates the dormant commerce clause. And so you might be protected by Rohrabacher FAR, but then there's another problem, which is that remember that Rohrabacher FAR applies to the DOJ. That's just one federal agency out of about a dozen that can get its hands on you. Department of Transportation, Department of Homeland Security, the folks who run security at the airport, they can do whatever they want. They can seize that shipment and destroy it. They can't criminally prosecute you because the DOJ and the DOJ alone does that. But there are a lot of other federal agencies involved, and Rohrabacher FAR only shuts off the DOJ, doesn't apply to anybody else.
David, I won't be picking you up at Logan on that one. Sorry.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Curt. 2 hours ago, you were like, okay, I want to go up there with you.
I don't know that guy. I'm here for my mom. I don't know who he is.
How do you get tire tracks off the back of a pullover?
So I will go to David Holland. I forgot I had two Davids. New York, flower now, medical patients, big announcements. People are selling it. New York is an expensive place for sure. How would interstate commerce or the dormancy clause affect the New York market? Tell me 2 years out.
Sure. I think it's an inevitability. New York will never be able to meet its own demand. And unofficially, it's believed to be the world's largest marketplace. And New York City alone does something over £1 million is what's been estimated. So that inevitably it's going to have to seek outside sources, whether it's going to be legal or not. It's going to be how it's always been done. So interstate commerce in that regard would be great. And I think that if they could come up with GMP and other testing standards to allow that to take place easily, that would be probably the best way to go. But with that, the Dormant Commerce Clause issue, it's an interesting thing. And I really have enjoyed reading the professor's law review article on it, because I come at this issue a little bit differently, which is, yes, the states can't discriminate from out-of-state product, but I'm not so sure that the feds would demur. But on a different angle that I've taken this, and I wrote this in an amicus brief to the United States Supreme Court in the case of Washington versus Barr, I believe that the federal government actually, when all three branches of it, being Congress, which has passed spending appropriations measures, and you had the executive branch with the Ogden and Cole memoranda and FinCEN guidance, and the United States district courts and going through courts of appeals upholding not only the McIntosh case, which said that medical patients were immune from prosecution under the Rohrabacher, but also that ancillary contracts other than flower-related contracts in the cannabis business are enforceable. At that point, when all three coordinate branches of government are trying to actually promote the state legalized cannabis industry, they have ceded the power through the 10th Amendment back to the states, which they had otherwise reserved under the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution. You have a nullification crisis that really needs to be resolved simply by Congress, rather than constantly batting around the States Acts, the MORE Acts, all the other proposals. Simply legalize it, deschedule it, and let the states handle it as a matter of, under their 10th Amendment and their police powers, regulate what they think is healthy and fair. And then the Dormant Commerce Clause becomes a much bigger, more forefront issue, because it will be then who are they going to get supply from and what should those standards be? So that's sort of how we look at it from New York. So 2 years from now, I believe New York will lead the way, because if it is and it remains the largest marketplace, then it's going to need to be supplied by all the other states that are out there. And if we go by Adam's theory, and Adam and I have talked about this before, if two states enter into a compact, and were that approved by the federal government, you would run into the same sort of estoppel problem, that they can no longer enforce the law because they're actually allowing the states to defeat the supremacy of the Controlled Substances Act. But then it would be just easy enough for all 48 other states to say, you know what, I want to join in that contract, but I don't have a ready need for a market to be supplied yet. But that's how you would just get around it. So it would be, an exercise of futility to find other ways around this, rather than Congress just simply stepping in and saying it's time to simply deschedule this and make this a states' rights matter.
Hey, one thing to note is your estimate of £1 million is not so far off. I've actually calculated the total amount of consumption by state and the amount of requirements to support both oil and flower consumption, and it's 1.3 million pounds. So you're not so far off, and I'm in the process of refreshing that right now. So good job on those estimates.
Well, thank you. No, it's nice to know that it's grounded in statistical analysis there, because I think that it's a big marketplace. Let's just leave it at that for sure.
David Holland, let me throw a follow-up question to you.
Sure.
And I'm going to give you a little background. Massachusetts legalized medical marijuana. You had to be fully integrated to get a license. We had, I forget how many licensees who were in that market. Then we legalized rec. And part of the deal was that the medical licensees got first crack at the rec licenses. Our rec operators who first opened up were extensions of the medical operators. And that happens in every state, because you can put together a dispensary quick, you can get a manufacturing facility put together reasonably fast. But no matter how quick you put together a cultivation facility, you can't rush Mother Nature. So you're waiting months for this plant to grow, to be harvested, to cure, and to be ready to be sold. How would it impact the development of the New York recreational market and, let's say, the social equity scene? Because one group in Massachusetts that got locked out in the beginning were people who were not fully integrated, and the social equity crowd couldn't afford to get fully integrated. So they're getting licensed, but very slowly and at a huge disadvantage. would it help New York if you could import immediately so that you had inventory available to feed those smaller operators who are not going to be fully vertically integrated?
Absolutely. And I think that you've identified what's really one of the biggest concerns out there for advocates like myself and others, which is that there are 10 registered organizations. Those are the medical operators that are fully verticalized, meaning they plant, process, cultivate, process, and sell their product. And they now are being given entree as the leaders into the recreational market. And it's going to be probably 18 months to 2 years before anybody else is going to be coming in with legalized sales. So you're giving them a multi-billion-dollar head start in a business that I don't think that the medical operators had much to do with to sustain it for the last 50 years of prohibition. So there is talk, and I've been in talk with both the cannabis industry associations and some legislators about provisional licenses to allow legacy operators that already have the not only the wherewithal, but they have the supply chain to be able to go and actually become the first retail sellers out there. So they're not put out of the market effectively by the 2-year head start that the registered organizations otherwise get. And it's a question of fundamental fairness. And this is where the Dormant Commerce Clause comes into play. Fundamentally, people are being encouraged to spend millions and millions of dollars to put together cultivation facilities that, if and when that day comes of federal legalization, they may very well be put out of business because New York, environmentally and otherwise, just is not as good as like California and Oregon and elsewhere. And somebody is, as Adam's saying, is going to be the Iowa of corn. Somebody's going to be the Iowa of cannabis. And I think this is a fairness issue that needs to be considered, and putting legacy operators first with provisional licenses would be the best way to continue to at least let the marketplace operate as it has for the last 50 years.
I mean, which is, I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump in, but which is why we are seeing in most of the limited license, consumer states that don't have, that don't organically have a cannabis production industry. That's where we're seeing domination by a few MSOs, right? If you look out at Oregon and California, we don't have that, right? Everybody says, oh, interstate commerce is going to happen, and then the big players are going to dominate the market. But the truth is that production out in the places where cannabis actually grows is very, diffuse. It's not, there's nobody that has 2% even of the production market, right? It's small farmers and small growers, right? And they're the ones who are getting killed out here for lack of access to markets that they need to serve. And it's smaller operators in those states that want to do anything else other than actually grow cannabis, that are then in total thrall to a few companies waiting for them to, grow, 1 million square feet in Lodi, New Jersey. And so, and the longer this goes, the more ensconced a few boardrooms get in dominating those markets. And the harder it is for smaller businesses and equity businesses to gain a foothold and to gain economic power. Right. And so this is why we think it's vital. I have also seen, I know you were mentioning this on the last segment, the dysfunction in Congress. And I've been in and out of drug policy reform and these issues for 30 years. And, I think that it's quite possibly, 5 years or more before we get full federal legalization. And in the meantime, you're going to wipe out the legacy market out here and disadvantage all of the small businesses that don't have, millions of dollars to build, giant facilities in places where cannabis, has no future.
Yeah. So just to piggyback on what Adam is saying, so I've actually looked at how much wealth destruction would occur if you insist upon these siloed state systems, and then there's full federal legalization. So basically what this does is it wipes out all these smaller businesses disproportionately because they have less revenue and less access to capital. But to set up all of these businesses only to have them lose out due to increased competition, the wealth destruction is to the tune of $80 billion. And so, those are real dollars. And right now there's no bankruptcy protection. So is there really truly a safety net for these businesses? I would say no, not at this point.
I mean, we're badly misincentivizing production in places where it has no future. And while a few large companies will be able to get their ROI, sell everything they can grow for the highest prices those states will ever see before the walls come down, everyone else who takes longer to license and get going is under huge threat, right? Where I come from New York City, right? And we had over a 20-year period, we had 430,000 people arrested for cannabis offenses. 86% of them were Black and Latino. Virtually none of them were arrested for growing cannabis, right? That's not what the industry has been there. And then when you silo the market, suddenly everyone says, "Oh, we can't see a pathway to equity," because you've turned the economics of an existing industry on its head, and you've put all the power in the hands of a production industry that has never existed there and has no real future there.
So I'm going to pull you guys down a little bit of a rabbit hole. I'm curious, and this
isn't a rabbit hole already?
No, we're
okay.
going down a real rabbit hole now. This one is directed more to Beau and to Adam, and I'm just looking for a little stock advice here. So, if in fact interstate transport happens, how do you think I believe there's two REITs that are servicing this industry, right? And we invited the CEO of one of them on to hear what he had to say about this, but he didn't seem to have interest in this particular topic. But what happens to these REITs that have millions and millions of dollars invested in really big grow facilities in really cold states?
Go ahead, Beau.
Yeah, so interesting question. I've looked at this as well. So basically what happens is the value of the property appreciates due to its the nature of it being in cannabis. Once the opportunity associated with cannabis is removed, then the value of that property goes back down to what is another comparable business that could be supported in that structure or on that property, et cetera. And so it's not as high a value. It'd be like taking a warehouse and saying, okay, it's been cultivating cannabis now. Maybe the best use for that outside of cannabis would be to, be a cold storage or to produce something else. So then on that, it would massively decrease the value of those properties and therefore the value of those REITs.
I've already figured out what the use of those warehouses are going to be. We tackled that on another show. We're going to turn them in, and we're not going to go into this one because it confused everybody last time. But the new wave in the funeral industry will be the composting of humans, not burying them underground, not pumping them full of formaldehyde. And all of these beautifully tricked out warehouses are going to get turned into that kind of facility. I wrote an article about that, but so you think these REITs are really going to tank should interstate commerce come into play?
Well, there's a potential. I'm just the good-looking economist wearing a sweater vest, right? So I'm not somebody that can talk about stock prices and REITs, but if you think about it, the value of those properties would the economic value would decline because they're no longer useful for cannabis purposes.
Right.
Professor Mikos, go ahead. I wanted you to respond to how David read your paper, but go ahead.
Well, I think two broader points I think David is getting at with that question. One is that you've got some people who have invested in the existing regulatory structure. And there's a question about what do we do for them? Do we just tell them, hey, you took a risk, you took a gamble on this state law and this crazy new cannabis legalization, and sorry, but the national market is rising and you're out of luck. You lose millions of dollars, either in the grow facility that you made or in the REIT. So that's one big question. I think you could make a case for some sort of compensation for companies that stuck their neck out and invested money, not knowing what the federal government was going to do down the line, not knowing if there would be interstate commerce. The other thing is, I think interstate commerce could affect different parts of the industry in different ways. I think that's what Adam and Beau and David were getting at before. Maybe it's good for retail. I'm not sure I buy that. Certainly we see in alcohol, heavy concentration at the production side, much more fragmentation at the retail side. But that's kind of the weird regulatory structure of alcohol. That's what we've endorsed through the 21st Amendment, through federal statutes that give states a little bit more leeway. we could have consolidation. I think we could have great economies of scale in production, like in cultivation, in processing, in retail, and there's no little guys, or there's a few craft players at the margin. But I think it is important to recognize that interstate commerce will affect different parts of the industry different ways.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in here for a minute. I just realized we're past the bottom of the hour. We're going to take a very, very quick break. We're going to be right back. Don't go away. And we've got a couple of great additional guests we're going to bring in that you're really going to want to hear from. So hang with us. We'll be right back.
So I think there's one very important difference between me and most of my team members and other cannabis accounting firms, especially outsourced cannabis accounting firms. With a lot of the other firms, you're going to find bookkeepers or folks that were accountants for their entire career, but they were junior accountants. I've spent most of my career alongside CFOs at public companies, companies with thousands of employees, public companies. So much of my career wasn't spent in the debits and credits. It was spent with the CFO, CEO, COO of large public companies, working on strategy, working on planning and big initiatives, working on projects such as mergers and integrations. So that high level experience, along with being able to do the debits and credits and having members of my team that also have fairly senior experience and also members of the team that are junior and can do the bookkeeping at a little bit lower cost than some of the people with the experience, gives our clients a much broader depth of experience than a lot of the other firms where you're hiring someone that is just a bookkeeper and can't help with the strategy side of it, or someone that's been an executive for a long time and can only help with the strategy but can't help with the hands-on.
All right, thanks for sticking with us. We're back here with the Green Rush on Friday afternoon. I'm your host, David Rabinovitz, joined by Curt Dalton, and we've got another guest that just joined us. And this is going to be very insightful. Andrew Klein is with a law firm in Washington, D.C., though he is out of Colorado, and he does a tremendous amount on the national level with cannabis. And one of his partners in the firm is James Cole of the Cole Memo. So hopefully Andrew's going to give us a little bit more insight as to where they think the federal government might go, how much leniency there might be, and where the line that you could get hit really hard is. So this way I don't have to wear the glasses and the hat. Andrew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no pressure, Andrew.
No pressure. I think, just to clarify, I think James Cole is at a different firm, but I did work with him at DOJ.
Ah, okay, that was the connection. My apologies.
No worries.
Okay, so I don't know how much of our discussion you've been hearing, but in general, we're debating this issue of how it might become legal and what the government's position would be if a couple of states tried to import and export to one another, legalized states. What are your thoughts on this?
So I can't see if Professor Mikos is still with us here.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm still here.
We're not letting you go anywhere.
Hi, Andrew.
All right, good to see you. Look, I mean, I think, Rob and I have spoken quite a bit about this issue. I think he is spot on. In some ways, frankly, I don't know that he goes far enough. But I think he, he's onto something legally significant. And I know Adam is going to hate me for saying this, but my view is that we should go a little bit further and even be having a conversation about a transition period prior to interstate commerce, because we've had a rough time watching what's happened in hemp. When Congress descheduled hemp in 2018, I testified before the FDA in 2019, We still haven't seen any regulations. We've seen nothing. We have no idea what FDA's views are on CBD. And, now you can buy Delta 8 in a gas station and in a convenience store, unregulated, untested, potentially unsafe, intoxicating products. And that's a real problem. So I actually would like to see the federal government get its act together, not only on CBD and hemp, but get their act together once cannabis is descheduled before we unleash interstate commerce.
In our previous segment, we talked about, is there some type of payments to those operators that are displaced by interstate commerce? But Professor Mikos, I'm not sure why that wouldn't apply to the hemp industry as well. I mean, the lack of regulations, the slow walk by the FDA and the like. I mean, that has definitely negatively impacted the hemp industry, just due to falling prices and regulatory murkiness. The value of hemp processing capacity declined $9.9 billion over the course of a 5-month period last year. So, why wouldn't there be, some type of payments made to those? I'm not sure if that's necessarily viable relative to interstate commerce. And so the best way to not have that type of impact is don't set up siloed structures where you're forcing people to set up cultivation and like when it's not necessary.
Yes, it's too late. We've already done that. Maybe going forward, you could say that, you could warn people, don't do this anymore. But the most sympathetic case, I think, can be made for those companies that have invested in states, recent legalizing states, adult use states like Michigan, for example, where they've just invested in this. They've spent a lot of money to build these indoor cultivation facilities. And all of a sudden, we're talking about, all right, tomorrow there's going to be interstate commerce and your business is uneconomical, and you lose, you're able to get a return on your investment. I don't think it has to be a cash payment. I think kind of tying into what Andrew mentioned before, this wouldn't be the first time in history where we've said, all right, you invested in a regulatory structure and we're changing the structure and we're going to try to compensate you. But you could compensate these firms just by saying, we're going to give you a little bit of time to recoup your money. Just like we give federal regulators and state regulators time to get up to speed on how to deal with interstate commerce. How do you tax and track product that's introduced from outside your closed loop? Those are tough questions. States need a few years to deal with them. Maybe you give them a few years not to deal with interstate commerce, and you give those companies that are just now getting up and running a few years. It's inexact. It's not like, okay, we think you lost $3 million, so here's a check for $3 million. But giving them a couple of years to recoup their investment, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's a form of compensation. That's sort of what I envision doing here.
I would say two things. What Andrew came in, the first thing he said was I was going to be upset with him, but I don't think so. I think there's a difference between the fear of what happens after, with interstate commerce under federal legalization, were it to happen today, right? And what might happen with interstate commerce if you left it to the states to opt in or out under their own systems, right? I think that I got involved in drug policy reform in 1992. And so, cannabis legalization has been sort of the holy grail for a long time. But watching the last couple of years and what has come through, I am not convinced that getting cannabis legalized at the federal level right now is going to in any way leave us with the kind of industry that many of us would like to see. And in fact, I think that there's a very good chance that it ends up really consolidating the industry and making it very difficult for any of the small players to survive. And I think that you have an entire like I've mentioned, that an entire generations old legacy production industry out here, and entire communities, entire region that have depended on the export of cannabis, right? And that that are now have done everything they can to get legal, and thousands and thousands of farmers are looking at economic catastrophe because they, and so you could, by allowing states to opt out, if you're that concerned that, okay, we just invested all this money in production and we don't want that to, the rug to be pulled out. So Michigan could say, okay, we're not going to opt in until the feds force us to open our doors. We're going to leave that in place and give everybody a chance, but the truth is that most of that production, whatever your timeline is going to be non-competitive when those doors come down, when those walls come down, right? It's not, you're not going to catch up. You can grow avocados in New York if you want. You can build a facility. It's just a terrible business idea, right? And so the time is great. And for those states that have, really, incentivize investment in production, and I've seen a lot of investment, would like to give that time to at least pay back before a lot of it goes under, then give them the chance not to opt in. But, you have a state like Arizona that's about to start using water to grow cannabis for 11 million people. That's insane, right? There's no way to justify that, right? You have a state like Delaware that is medically legal, and they're never going to have a fully fleshed out production industry. And their patients are stuck in illicit markets for years, totally insane and unjustifiable, right? If you have legal markets in a free country, right, then we need to be able to allow those markets. And by keeping the feds out, we allow them to opt out, right? And you have to allow those markets that need to do so to be able to have normal commerce. Beau's the economist, I'm not, but my name's Adam Smith, so I think about economics a lot. And what we are doing right now in a lot of places in the country is economically insane, and it's hurting a lot of people, and it's hurting mostly small businesses, right? And so for the states that need, if you're going to, Minnesota and Wisconsin may legalize next year, there's no future in growing cannabis at scale in Wisconsin. Maybe, but I don't think so. And for them to start down that road so they can feed their industry for some period of years before something else happens and everything has to get reorganized, then no one would ever choose to do that. And so we need to come up with something that does transition us, but it needs to transition us from here. And it needs to let the states that want and need to engage in normal commerce in their legal markets to do that. And if Massachusetts wants to sit that out until their doors are forced open, that's totally fine. And so I think, federal legalization is one thing, and I'm not so sure it's a great thing, and I'm thankful that it's a ways away, but let's get the market right.
So I want to introduce another panelist that just jumped in. He was a little delayed with some technical issues, but Big Ed D'Souza. Ed runs River Run Gardens. He is a cultivator in Massachusetts, very well known. Thanks for joining us, Ed. And he's going to be able to, and as we talk about this, Ed can give us the vantage point of how does it impact a smaller independent grower if all of a sudden the stuff can move across state lines, and what he can do to protect his turf. Ed, introduce yourself to everybody.
Yeah, good evening. Again, I apologize for being a little late. I was trying to get on the on the link here, and anyway, let me just jump right to it. So my name is Ed D'Souza. I'm a managing partner, founder of River Run Gardens. We're a licensed cultivator here in Massachusetts, based out of Newburyport. My license is a micro business license, which is something that Massachusetts had put in play to give mom and pops an opportunity to get into the game. I've got over 20 years of experience in cultivation on the original market, now in the legal market. And I'll say that I am one of a very few that have actually made it to where I am, with lots of others struggling to get to my position. Even though I'm in the position I'm in right now, I'll tell you, I'm still in the red. It took me 5 years to get to where I am. It took me about a year or so to actually put out the product that I'm kind of happy about. And I still say another 6 months to get to where we want to go. That said, listen, this is it's a moving train. And, now that a lot of people are seeing the money coming in, municipalities, the feds, everybody, there's nothing we're going to be able to do to stop, I'll say it, corporate greed coming in, dominating the industry. My biggest fear with federal legalization, aside from the proposal of putting another 28% of taxes on the product, is that you're going to have with interstate transportation, you're going to have organizations like Monsanto grabbing a piece of this industry, and they don't take a piece; they take the whole thing. But here's my issues. Right now, we had medical market for quite some time. We've got a legal market that's still trying to take shape, at least in Massachusetts. But other states throughout the union, everybody's got their own set of rules. So if the feds step in and they decide that they're going to try to harmonize the rules, which rules are going to take place? You look at Massachusetts right now is a very hard state to get the material passed. There seems to be some sort of idea that you can have less than 10,000 CFU, colony forming units, on a product, and you're testing 7 grams out of a 15-pound batch. How is that going to fly in states like Michigan that aren't testing for certain microbiologicals? Who's going to, how are you going to bring cannabis from a state that doesn't test for certain microbiologicals into a state that wants to test for certain microbiologicals? What are you going to do for states that have to use the metric system and other states like California that are fighting using the metric system? So is there going to be a universal seed to sale tracking? Is it going to be up to the states? How do you harmonize that data? And if you open up the door for interstate travel, how it's going to stop the WTO from saying, listen, Chile, Portugal, all these other nations that are growing cannabis, how are you going to, stop them from coming in here? I have no problem with free trade. I honestly feel that if your product is good, it will speak for itself. People will want it. People will support it. But I think we need to really shape the regulations here. Let's figure out, let's get the states that are legal right now to get their act in order before the feds step in, because we all know what happens when the feds step in. We have a industry right now that is dominated by people that don't even really use this medicine. I mean, they're going to separate medicinal and recreational, where realistically, I'm sorry, everything is medicinal. You want it to relieve the stress at the end of a hard day's work? That's medicinal. So there's a lot of stuff that has to get done before we can open up the borders. And, in terms of, how my business will survive, well, my business will survive through tenacity. If I don't put out a good product, I don't deserve to survive. Let the next person step up. But there's a lot of other people that were in the position I was in 6 months ago that deserve to be here as well. And yeah.
So I'm in the middle of conducting a national survey of cannabis operators. It's a business conditions and industry sentiment survey. And some of the preliminary results show that just as in the case of Ed, only 43% of the respondents are actually making a profit in this space. A lot of the issues are associated with lack of banking, lack of finances, and 280E taxation. So in terms of getting the industry from point A to point B, the interim solution seems very logically to be interstate commerce, but at the same time, it needs to have some type of federal reform associated with access to capital and not having these oppressive taxes that go as a result of it being federally illicit. And so that would tend to give more opportunities for profitability and for survivability post legalization. But right now, it's so oppressive that very few are actually making a profit. Many are surviving, majority of which are small businesses.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I mean, if you don't mind me jumping in about the profit here, there's plenty of profit. It's just a matter of it's only in the hands of a few. I know that my state of Massachusetts pulled in over $2.2 billion since 2018, but that's really only in the hands of about 5% of the operators. You have big business who's jumped in and pretty much bribed municipal boards to say, we don't want to allow a special permit or a community host agreement for this business to operate. We had, as soon as, you have a building open, they will buy it and sit on it and not allow that to be leased. So while that there are, a lot of taxes, a lot of regulatory fees and stuff that go into it, you also have a monster out there who are stepping on the throats of potential small businesses and not allowing them a piece of the pie.
But isn't that an argument for interstate commerce?
No, it's not, because what's happening here is that you're not allowing this market to really develop in the areas that have already had the market, but under the original market. You're now allowing all of a sudden now it's attractive to venture capitalists. It's attractive to Wall Street. It's attractive to Canadian companies. It's attractive to the Russian mob. It's attractive to a lot of these entities out there that are squishing the dream that has kept food on the table for families for hundreds of years.
Well, it sounds like pick your poison, because at this point, it's either 95% of the market is with these big players, or go the route of interstate commerce and be subjected to the things you just mentioned. So is there any good answer for the small grower, let's say in Massachusetts?
Good answer? Listen, I can't solve the world's problems. I don't think anybody can in one conversation. I think maybe it takes a round table. If I were to sit there and give an opinion, I would say that if you look at like Massachusetts, we have a Cannabis Control Commission, we have a Cannabis Advisory Board. But if you look up who are sitting on those two different tables, you really don't have a representative that would, represent each faction that is in this game. You've got, a person who represents big business in Netta, who was bought out as soon as they had an opportunity to. You have a person that is in charge of representing labs, who's in charge of a lab that's currently going throughout the country that's dominating. Its representation's huge, and without people having the voice, it's just going to be a matter of an uphill battle for a lot of small players looking to legally pay taxes.
Professor Mikos, he brought up some good points Edward did about money laundering, Russian mob, obviously venture capital's legal. Where does your paper or your ideas fit if we did interstate commerce? What are the downsides, like he mentioned? Are there some risks to that, or would the DOJ kind of be looking out for that?
You mean in terms of if someone just tried to run the gauntlet before legalization?
Yeah, exactly. Try to set up their chess pieces before the game.
Yeah, I mean, it gets back to one of the scenarios we talked about early on, which is that you do risk prosecution. You have to take on the risk and then convince a court that, hey, this is something I'm allowed to do. But if the federal government wanted to target you, it would be within its rights to do that. Everything we're talking about here today, whether it's in-state or across state lines, is fully illegal. And unless it's protected by that Rohrabacher FAR, unless you're talking about what a state sort of captions as medical, which maybe Edward is right, that's an illusory distinction, but states make it. Everybody is vulnerable for possessing, cultivating, processing, testing, distributing, possessing cannabis. And there's no way around that without federal legalization.
Andrew, you were going to speak, Andrew. Go ahead. When Edward was going, go ahead.
I was actually going to comment on something that Beau had said, but I just want to say something here. I mean, if you're concerned about organized crime, go ahead and unleash interstate commerce and see what happens, because the illicit market will explode without clear regulation in place. No one is going to be able to tell what's legal and what's illegal. You're going to have trucks driving across the country bringing cannabis wherever, and it's going to be virtually impossible to know where that cannabis is coming from. But I did want to just say something, comment on something Beau said, because I think he was onto something, which is we have to deschedule. No matter what, whether you're for interstate commerce or against interstate commerce, or you want to pause on the dormant commerce clause or you don't, we have to deschedule, because there are so many obstacles in the way of the cannabis industry right now because of scheduling. And he mentioned a couple, 280E and banking, but it's really the only way to get us to real social equity reform. It's the only way to get DEA out of the way and put FDA ultimately in charge. It's the only way to really fully displace the illicit market. It's the only way to remove cannabis from a schedule of drugs that the federal government right now deems to be dangerous, like LSD and heroin and meth, and put it where it belongs, which is in the public health realm. It's the only way to open research. And so, there are 1,001 reasons why you might be for or against interstate commerce, or for and against a pause in the Dormant Commerce Clause, but not descheduling is not an answer.
Hey, I'm going to jump in for a minute. Professor Mikos has to leave in about 1 minute. He's got another obligation. So Professor Mikos, thank you for joining us. I've got 2 very quick questions for you. If somebody wants to find your papers, how do they do that? And can you just give them a quick list of some of what you've written that's relative to the cannabis sector and what each paper is about?
Yeah, happy to do that. I've dropped some links in the chat function. Not sure if everyone can see that, but maybe David, you can pass.
I'm going to get it and drop it over to YouTube.
Great. So those are links to a website that I run where I blog about current developments in this field. Also have links to some of my papers. The second one is a paper I wrote, I believe, with Scott Bloomberg. This is the latest paper that talks about why interstate commerce, at least in the short term, could cause a lot of problems in the industry and for regulators, and why Congress, how Congress could suspend that, at least temporarily, create this transition period, Andrew puts it. The other one is talking about why we're going to get interstate commerce potentially sooner than people realize. It's called Interstate Commerce in Cannabis. Makes the claim that, in fact, this Dormant Commerce Clause, it's going to kick in immediately, even before federal legalization, and cause these disruptions that I've talked about. So it talks about the economics of that and some of the concerns. But the paper with Scott is really about how to address that and maybe temporarily. You don't, as Andrew said, you don't say, okay, let's just not legalize for 7 years. That may happen anyway, just because of inertia in Congress. But instead, what you do is you deschedule, you legalize this federally, but you manage the transition to interstate. Maybe you give states the option, they can opt in, as Adam suggests, but you don't force them to accept it, at least for a few years. Give them a chance to adjust, give some firms a chance to adjust, make a buck on this, maybe figure out how to deal with the national market, but you don't foist it on them sort of overnight. But thanks so much for having me. Great to see everybody. Hope to do this again soon, but I do have to run.
Great. Professor, thank you very much. You've been a great guest. All right, we normally run from 4 to 6. Every now and then we have great subjects or passionate guests, and we run a little bit over. And I think today's going to be, unless somebody has to jump out, and if you need to, go ahead. We're going to keep the conversation going for a little while longer. Please stay with us. And I'm going to turn to Curt because now I'm running out of, I got a couple of questions, but I was grabbing the professor's papers. The paper he just mentioned about legalization without disruption, why Congress should let states restrict interstate commerce in cannabis. I would urge you to get it and read it. I just printed it today, and you'll look really smart to all your friends, because this paper, while he's published it, it won't be published in a law review until March of next year. So when it comes out, you can look at everybody and go, yeah, I read that.
So I guess I'll start it off real quick with Beau. I feel Edward's pain because he's damned if these do and he's damned if these don't. He's going to get crushed by the bigger players. They're getting the majority economically, or you open up the valves and he's going to get crushed from out of state. What's the solution? What can he do? Rock in a hard place here.
Well, I think some of the issues that folks in the industry do not consider is the fact that this is a global industry, that this is a national industry. And a lot of times folks don't do their due diligence on what is their risks, to their operation, and they don't monitor that. And so I think maybe I don't necessarily have solutions, but they definitely need to start with just an understanding of what their risks are, and then adjust accordingly. A lot of folks are positioning themselves right now for exit, looking to get acquired by larger groups. Others are trying to band together via cooperatives so that they can have smaller groups banding together so that they can compete relative to larger, more commercial operations. And so those are some solutions, but by not understanding the risk, then you fall into the same pitfalls that were bestowed upon the hemp industry. You know, it's a very salient example that we got going right now.
Curt, can I jump in on this? Because
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the answer is, you know, what I said in the beginning, it's got to be a transition period before interstate commerce kicks in for these reasons. You know, my understanding is big tobacco can move a pack of cigarettes across the country cheaper than the U.S. Postal Service can move a piece of mail. And, you know, for someone who is just getting in, or even someone who's been in the industry for a couple of years, it's going to be impossible to compete with that kind of infrastructure. And so you've got to give, especially these social equity license holders who are just getting up and running, you've got to give these small businesses time to solidify in the marketplace, to build a brand, right? That people want to buy, that people recognize, and to build brand allegiance takes time. But you've got to give people that runway. And because look, interstate commerce is inevitable. We're all Americans here. We all believe in free trade. We all believe in commerce. Of course, it's going to happen. It should happen. It must happen. But there has to be a runway where the people who have, you know, taken all the risk in this industry, right? I mean, the people who have been in this industry from 0 to 10 years are the people who have taken all of the regulatory risk. They have been, you know, violating the Controlled Substances Act for as long as they've been in business, and facing potential jail time over it. And as soon as cannabis becomes descheduled, there is no risk for anybody, right? Other than financial. And so you've got to give those people who have been rolling up their sleeves and taking that risk the time to be successful. And the only way to do that is a transition period before interstate commerce happens.
David Holland, go. I know you got it. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And one of our taglines with the New York City Cannabis Industry Association is to infuse consciousness into capitalism. Because if we're going to market or structure a market around notions of social equity and equitable participation by those people that created the marketplace, you got to let them in. You know, their one facility, GTI, has just, you know, secured a 400,000 square foot grow facility when they get their opportunity to get their legal license here. That's not the way to do this. And I completely agree with Andrew that you got to, those people that created the opportunities of the market have to be the ones to enjoy the benefits of it first. And I don't think that offends Dormant Commerce Clause. I don't think that offends anything else other than it's a rollout plan, just like any other rollout plan, whether it be one round of licenses, then another. Nobody says the big licenses have to go out immediately to the REIT facilities, who, again, you know, while they operate at a grand scale, they aren't the people that operate the grand market that's here right now. So to avoid market collapse, I really do think we've got to create, you know, an opportunity for provisional licenses like we talked about earlier, and other opportunities for people to sustain the market that's already here, but in an open and notorious way so they can start to generate the tax revenue that then goes to the social equity funds.
I do have good news for Edward, though, because according to Beau, David and Adam are 300,000 pounds short of supply in New York. So if Governor Baker and Governor Hochul got together, you might be getting some good Newburyport weed shipped over.
Let me just say this. I'm sorry for anybody who thinks anything good is going to come out of New York, because if you look at New York's testing, you know, right now, they're going to sit there and have a threshold of 200 CFU. That means that unless you grow your cannabis in a class tier 1 clean room, and then somehow we're able to sterilize your package and have it sitting in a dispensary that's sterilized, you're never going to have your cannabis naturally passed. So what's going to happen is what's already happening here in Massachusetts and other states. People are going to start investing in remediation machines, gamma ray technologies that's going to irradiate that bud, and there's no long-term studies. We don't import fruit and vegetables from Chernobyl, so I don't understand why it's okay and acceptable to go ahead and smoke cannabis that has been irradiated. Other than that, I want to thank everybody. I do have to jump off right now, and I really appreciate you guys inviting me on this.
Thank you, Edward. David's on mute there, unmute. You know what? We are at 6:08. So how about everybody give us your wrap-up minute on where you think of the dormancy clause and legalization, starting with Beau.
Well, I think that there's a very compelling economic argument for interstate commerce. And with the time to market, with the ability to deploy a regulatory program, a tax program, without the wealth destruction, with the lowering of prices and increasing the access not only to the commercial adult use users, but also providing greater access to genetics by the medical community, there's a very, very, very compelling argument for interstate commerce.
All right, thank you. Who wants to go next? How about Adam? We haven't heard from you. Go ahead.
No, I agree with Beau. I understand the concerns of Andrew. I think that we need to allow states that feel like they have a nascent industry, that there's a future that they want to support, to leave their doors closed until the federal government comes in and says you have to. But I think that to force every state to create siloed markets has already shown to be an economic problem, and it is warping the market in a way that is going to create a bubble and burst in a number of states, and is going to wipe out a lot of the people that we want to see as being part of the market, whether that's on the production side from where cannabis actually grows, to on the consumer side to where it has always been sold and distributed by small businesses. And so 5 more years of this, and I think this industry will be almost entirely run by a few boardrooms.
David C. Holland, go ahead.
I don't know if I'm totally on board. I understand Adam's fear, and I agree that there's a lot of problems here, but there's brand loyalty and there's other loyalties that exist within the cannabis space. And particularly one thing, unlike Philip Morris, like Marlboro cigarettes are one versus another in whatever state they're in. They taste the same, they smoke the same with beer, same with other, mass-produced products. But cannabis really seems to buck that trend. And when we used to put on the cannabis cups with High Times magazine, the one thing would happen is the winner of the cup would immediately, growers would start hybridizing that seed with other strains, trying to create new and different plant alternatives. So I'm not sure that mass production at the level that Green Thumb and others that are doing hundreds of thousands of square feet, well, they could grow the strains. I don't think they can do it in a way that's going to appease the consumers and in a way that they have the same knowing intelligence on the ground of who that consumer is. So I think there's still a lot of room for that concierge service that delivery brings and other small craft growers. But, it is something that I hope will, continue, that there's room for everybody in the marketplace, just like you're seeing the reemergence of craft brewers. I would like to see not the decline of craft and then come back, but there's definitely a place for all of it. And I don't know that mass production is the best production.
I need a whole 3-hour show to go on branding. I'm on the Millennials Top 10 Wanted site, so don't get me going. Go ahead, Andrew, finish us off.
I think we should be myopically focused on 3 things. We've got to deschedule. We've got to deschedule. It should have happened yesterday. My brother, who's from New England, died at 37 from an alcohol overdose. I've never heard of anybody who's died from an overdose of cannabis. There's just absolutely no good public policy reason to keep cannabis as a Schedule I drug. We've got to deschedule it, but we have to do it responsibly. So after we deschedule, we need a transition period to protect the public health. Let's make sure that FDA gets those regulations in place and TTB gets those regulations in place before we just open up the marketplace. Let's make sure those state regulations stay where they are until those federal regulations are up and running. And we have to protect those social equity license holders. We've got to give them a real runway, a real opportunity to succeed. This is an industry that historically has screwed a lot of people who don't look like most of us on this Zoom, right? And so we need to make sure that those folks who have taken the risk in this new state legal marketplace get the benefit of it. And the only way to do that is a transition period prior to interstate commerce.
Well said. Now to our host.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody. You guys were great panelists. This is probably, we've been doing this show for a little over a year, and I have been more excited about this particular episode than any other episode we've done. You guys did great. We got a lot of really good perspectives here. I've got one final quick question, and that's for Beau. If somebody wants to participate in your survey, how do they do that?
Yeah, I can. If I can forward over to a link to send out to your folks, it's and so yeah,
great.
If that's probably easiest.
Send us over the link and we'll get it published for you. But
Yeah,
thank you.
I appreciate that.
And everybody out there, thanks for watching, and everybody who's going to see this over the next couple of weeks as our production team slices and dices this and puts it out on the web. You should be watching it live. It's a whole new world of weed out there, as Jimmy would say. Use it responsibly. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next Friday at 4 p.m.
Coming up on Weed Talk News this week, MJ BizCon and MJ Unpacked. History now in Las Vegas as over 30,000 people return to check out the trade show business. Plus, cannabis flower is coming to New York State as long as you're in the Rochester area and have a medical card. Plus, employers in the Empire State can't fire employees for cannabis use after hours anymore. And more bad news for the vape industry as the U.S. Postal Service bans shipping of cartridges and hardware. Plus, is there movement towards cannabis reform at the federal level? 10 Republican senators are leaning in that direction. Details on that and more on Weed Talk News next. Pro Cannabis Media Programming and PCM TV is supported by Revolutionary Clinics, Massachusetts' #1 medical dispensary where the patient comes first, and by Salient Systems for Video Surveillance. You've got regulations, Salient has solutions for your security needs. And by Accounting Buds, your #1 CPA specialist for the cannabis industry. And by Artery Pay, easy, cheap, fun, and legal, just like cannabis should be.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Weed Talk News. I'm Jimmy Young from Pro Cannabis Media.
I'm Elena Pinto from Pro Cannabis Media, and our top story today is a look back at the largest cannabis trade show in the world. It's the 10th annual MJ BizCon in Las Vegas, and Jimmy was there. So how were the crowds for the first face-to-face cannabis convention in Las Vegas? And it's been 2 years, right?
That's right. And I'll tell you what, there was probably 95% masked up, as were the regulations for the Las Vegas Convention Center, about 27,000 attendees. And that's about 85% of the record turnout of 2019. CEO of MJ Biz Daily, Chris Walsh, was relieved after a difficult 2 years off because of the pandemic.
It's extremely gratifying. We had a very tough year in 2020. I think all of us did in one sense or another, right? For a business like ours too, it was very rough. And I had taken over as CEO in January of last year, and got into a period with COVID where we had to make business changes. We couldn't do MJ BizCon, we couldn't do our events, and we had to really rethink what we were doing. So to finally have gotten here to a place where we have the industry all together, it's bustling, it's busy, people are excited about the future of cannabis. It's a really surreal and amazing feeling that we were able to come roaring back, not only as MJ BizCon, but also as an industry. And the industry did really well throughout all this. And you can see it here. Other events are coming back at 50% of where they were in 19. Look around here, look at the buzz. Look at how many people are here. This industry's rocking and rolling, so we're really excited.
On the other side of the strip was MJ Unpacked at Mandalay Bay, a much smaller trade show more focused on investment capital. There, I interviewed the Marijuana Industry Trade Association's Dimitri Downing from Arizona, who believes interstate commerce of cannabis is coming sooner rather than later.
you have to wrestle with how you deploy capital and plan for long term. And we all know interstate commerce is coming within 3 to 7 years. We need an industry that's going to advocate aggressively for interstate commerce. And when interstate commerce comes, hopefully, you won't have to manufacture in all these states, just adjust to little things like labeling, testing, and packaging, etc. Now we've shifted over to paradigm 2 over the last 10, 12 years, which is the concept that we're kind of wrestling with right now, that we've inherited and kind of accepting. Merit-based applications, limited licensing applications, there can only be a few dispensaries, there can only be a few manufacturers. All that is nonsense. We need to fight for paradigm 3, which is the open markets, which is competition, which is opportunity, because ultimately paradigm 3 is going to be best for the patients and the consumers.
Coming up on Green Rush Live, the business of cannabis this week is interstate commerce of cannabis already legal under the Constitution and laws? One law professor from Vanderbilt University says yes. It's Professor Robert Mikos, and his thoughts were published by the BU Law Press. Now he'll be joined with legal leaders, compliance officers, CEOs, and other economists to debate this on Green Rush Live, the business of cannabis talk show on PCM TV and Pro Cannabis Media.
California is arguably known as the world's epicenter for weed, but the grass isn't so green for everyone in the industry there. The founder of a medical dispensary in San Luis Obispo has pleaded guilty to bribery charges. With that and more on the California cannabis scene right now, here's Christopher Smith from the American Cannabis Report.
I'm Christopher Smith, publisher of the American Cannabis Report, bringing you the roundup from the great cannabis state of California for Weed Talk News. An Emerald Cup judge likes what he's seeing in 2021. Joey Sullivan is head of procurement for Mercy Wellness, but on the side, he coordinates the judging effort for the Emerald Cup, the industry's premier annual event for judging the quality of this year's crop. And how's the 2021 harvest shaping up? Honestly, right now it's probably been the most promising I've seen in a couple of years, Sullivan told LA Weekly, especially since fire season didn't impact the Emerald Triangle very much this year. As for what he's seeing so far, a lot of exotics, but expectations about a lot of dessert weed like cakes, gelatos, and sherbets have proven correct so far. Oaktown, otherwise known as the city of Oakland, is known for its cannabis social equity programs. According to a report shared with the Oakland Cannabis Commission, 59 social equity license recipients have secured $3.7 million in loans from the city. About 60% of the loans are current, 34% are at least a little behind, and 7% or 4 social equity businesses are so far behind, the city has sent them to collections. Jason Russell, a San Francisco attorney, said these borrowers sent to collections don't have many options because corporate bankruptcy laws are federal laws and therefore unavailable to cannabis businesses. Rumor has it that the legal cannabis industry does about $7 billion in revenue, but the illicit market does $8 billion. One reason is too many cultivation licenses, which produce about 3 times what the population demands. At the same time, too few dispensaries. Almost 70% of the cities and counties opted out of allowing cannabis shops, and as a result, there are only 2 dispensaries per 100,000 people in California. By comparison, Oregon and Colorado have about 18 shops for every 100,000 residents, and Alaska, even more. Operation Hammer Strike is getting results. Over the last 8 weeks, the sheriff's office has served 183 search warrants, made 238 arrests, and seized 187,000 cannabis plants, 39,000 pounds of processed cannabis, 57 guns, and $563,449 exactly in cash. No change. Which the sheriff's office described as illicit narcotic sales proceeds, which means the sheriff's office is going to be grabbing that cash. Operation Hammer Strike has also taken down 1,000 greenhouses and 2 extraction labs. And I'm Christopher Smith for the American Cannabis Report, sending peace and love from the cannabis heaven, California, for Weed Talk News.
Hey, Elena, have you ever had to take a drug test for employment?
Nope, haven't.
Well, if you're in New York, now that the Department of Labor has introduced new guidelines, you can actually consume your favorite cannabis plant at home. Just make sure you don't bring your weed to work or show up high. That's a precedent-changing policy in that state now that New York has legal adult use cannabis laws.
And that's not the only changes in New York State. Their medical program has never been able to sell flower to their patients, just tinctures and edibles and topicals. But now that the adult use law is in place, medical dispensaries can now sell flower to their patients. The only issue with this right now is that you have to be in Rochester, New York, and you have to go to Columbia Care because they are the only ones licensed to do just that at this point, Jimmy.
And now with our Michigan report, here's the normal executive director for that state and our Canacaster, Rick Thompson. Rick?
Hello again, everyone. This is the Michigan Report with Rick Thompson on Weed Talk News. Let's begin. The big news of the week is the performance of the House Regulatory Reform Committee on Tuesday regarding the controversial package of 6 bills proposing to radically change the 12-year-old medical marijuana program. The first contentious hearing saw Committee Chair Roger Houck give preferential treatment during testimony to government agents, public relations specialists, and corporate sponsors. They received 80% of the time available for testimony, forcing the 100 patients and caregivers to have their say after some of the committee members had left the chamber to attend to other duties. Despite stating over and over that everyone would get their chance to speak, in the end, it was all a lie. The committee resolved their voting business and dismissed from the chamber with more than 1 hour of committee time remaining. Representative Houck could have used that empty time to allow testimony from the organizations and people affected by the proposed changes. He did not. The chamber was filled to standing room only capacity with people ready to tell their story. Once again, government refused to let the people speak. Now, the next stop for these bills is the House floor, again, where citizens are not allowed to speak and corporate money buys votes on a regular basis. We'll keep you updated on the progress of the bill package. November 4th is Lobby Day for Michigan's patient, caregiver, and adult use consumer groups. Dozens of participants are already registered and will engage the lawmakers on a variety of issues of relevance to consumer groups, including the bills I just mentioned. There's no cost to attend and participate. Groups are meeting in the Lansing offices of the Michigan Cannabis Industry Association to prepare for the multi-pronged effort. Register to participate in the Lobby Day by visiting minormal.org/no changes. And Tom Beller of Real Leaf Solutions is in the news again. Now, Wednesday was his birthday, and congratulations, but he's in the news for publishing an op-ed with his wife, Krista, regarding the role of the regulated industry in the parallel caregiver program in Michigan. Mr. Beller argues that the two systems are complementary, not in conflict. And as former caregivers themselves, he and Krista are in support of keeping the current medical program as is, without changes. You can find that editorial on bridgemi.com. And that's it for the Michigan Report with Rick Thompson and Weed Talk News.
Opportunity grows on the East Coast. This month, medical marijuana patients in Connecticut can finally start cultivating their own plants. Under the state's recreational law, adults 21 and older can grow plants starting in July of 2023. So that's a bit of a wait. So Governor Ned Lamont is taking marijuana matters into his own hands and implementing new legislation to move things along. Now, medical patients 18 and older can grow up to 6 personal plants. They have to be grown indoors and kept away from recreational users and minors. But still, it's good news for those medicinal users who would have otherwise had to wait another 1.5 years for the recreational rule to take effect. With that, let's get to our Green Nurse Report from Jessie Lynn Dolan in Vermont.
I'm Jessie Lynn Dolan from Nurse Grown Organics and Vermont Cannabis Nurses, and this is the Weed Talk News Vermont Report. In-town news around Vermont, both Londonderry and Jamaica voted to allow cannabis retailers to set up shop next year. Jamaica also rejected an article to allow integrative licenses, which effectively bans large-scale cannabis operations from the town. Woodstock will be voting about retail shops at Village Meeting in March, and the Ludlow Select Board will be having a retail cannabis informational meeting on Monday, November 1st, with the vote scheduled for Tuesday, November 2nd. Vermont Cannabis Control Board Advisory Committee member Tim Wessel published an op-ed in Vermont Digger opposing a recent decision by the licensing subcommittee to cap town cannabis licenses at $100 a year. Chris Brimmer, the zoning administrator for the town of Fairleigh and secretary of the Vermont Progressive Party, also published an op-ed in Vermont Digger saying the 1% option tax should be automatic instead of opt-in. High Fidelity Inc., the parent company of Series Med, formerly Champlain Valley Dispensary, applied for an Act 250 permit for building a $6.6 million facility in Milton to grow, harvest, and process cannabis, largely expanding its current corporate operations. That's the Vermont report for Weed Talk News. I'm Vermont's cannabis nurse, Jessie Lynn Dolan.
Elena, have you ever visited the INSA dispensary in East Hampton or Springfield, Massachusetts by any chance?
East Hampton. I definitely have been there.
Well, we've been to East Hampton as well. That's the manufacturing dispensary for INSA. But the really cool, what I would call destination dispensary is INSA in Springfield. It's right down the street from the Basketball Hall of Fame. And right now, INSA is celebrating because they were the most awarded brand in the first ever High Times Cannabis Cup for Massachusetts. Now, I believe there were 11 categories. They won for Best Vape Sativa. And I've got to recommend this product, the Double Caramel Sea Salt Chocolates. Just saying that makes your mouth water, doesn't it? I mean, they're so good. Julian Rose is the director of manufacturing there. He's a award-winning chocolatier. We have sampled those items at INSA, and we want to congratulate the INSA dispensary for that. With more from the Massachusetts area, the Bay State Cannabis Report, if you will, here's Ron Marshalsea. Ron?
I'm Ron Marshalsea with the Massachusetts Cannabis Report for Weed Talk News. Deanna Martin, the owner of Northern Herb, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for tax evasion, money laundering, and cannabis distribution and possession. Northern Herb allowed medical marijuana to be purchased and delivered to those who did not prove that they were registered with the Massachusetts Medical Cannabis Program. From May 2016 through July 2018, Northern Herb's revenue exceeded $14 million and did not pay taxes on its profits. They also did not withhold, remit, or pay any payroll or income taxes, including not reporting worker wages to the IRS. Through the High Times' first ever Massachusetts Cannabis Cup, cannabis consumers across the state selected INSA as its most awarded brand. Products came from 45 local brands, and INSA was a finalist in 6 categories, including 2 first-place awards. Co-founder of INSA, Peter Gallagher, was quoted as saying, "For the very first time in Massachusetts, High Times magazine asked cannabis consumers to judge the state's range of products, and we are honored that people across Massachusetts rated INSA products so highly. To be judged as the Commonwealth's most awarded brand overall is a true honor." INSA's products are sold at their own retail stores in East Hampton, Springfield, and Salem, as well as other retailers throughout Massachusetts. Speaking of products, Garden Remedies, a cannabis shop in the state, has introduced a new type of spice in an edible for Halloween, and it's not pumpkin spice. Made with ghost pepper and capsaicin extract from a Massachusetts supplier, the spooky spicy gummy edible packs a punch of heat. The head of the kitchen at Garden Remedies wanted to take advantage of all the spicy food challenges that have been popping up across social media. Thus, the spooky spicy gummy edible was created. That's this week's Massachusetts Cannabis Report. For Weed Talk News, I'm Ron Marshalsea.
Delta 8 has been the buzz of the cannabis market this year, making headlines with its mere existence in a legal gray area. But unlike other states that have outright banned the synthetic cannabinoid, Louisiana is looking to bite into the trend by allowing Delta 8 in food. Under Louisiana state law, consumable hemp is allowed. And according to the State Department of Health, applications are now open for businesses to use cannabinoids in food, including Delta 8. Meanwhile, the FDA won't come up with guidelines for CBD in food. So no wonder Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas said our federal cannabis laws are contradictory. Oklahoma allows Delta 8 sales, and their cannabis industry seems to be booming, at least in some capacity, as Dion Osborne explains in our Oklahoma report.
I'm Dion Osborne with the Black Wall Street Times. This is Weed Talk News. I recently sat down with a director of Oklahomans for Responsible Cannabis Action to talk about two bills that were recently filed, two petitions, one to legalize recreational marijuana and one to give the industry its own freestanding agency.
So the effort here, what we're doing with the petitions that have been put forth, is we're looking to keep the success but clean up the mess.
The issue of expungements was intentionally placed in this proposal. Tell me why you felt it was important to include that.
We believe that there are some common sense things that hold people back unnecessarily. That's basically residue from the war on drugs. And so we want to clean that up. I've heard maybe 10, 12,000 folks that would probably qualify for this type of records expungement.
That's very interesting just to hear that is in this bill. So on to the Medical Marijuana Enforcement and Transparency Act.
By having our own freestanding agency, it will increase transparency. There's another thing going on there. Industrial hemp is currently a complete different side deal for Department of Agriculture. So what we want is an Oklahoma Cannabis Commission that deals with all of it. It's all the same plant.
I'm Dion Osborne with the Black Wall Street Times. This is Weed Talk News.
There's been another acquisition of a media company that is pro-cannabis. Beringer Capital, a private equity firm, has acquired a majority stake in the stock market site Benzinga for $300 million. Now, Benzinga was started in 2010 by Jason Raznick on a $3,000 monthly budget. Benzinga now has an international workforce of more than 100 pros and a monthly readership, a base of 25 million people in over 125 countries. Now, with the Green Market Report, here's Deborah Borchardt. Deborah.
This is the business update for Weed Talk News from the Green Market Report. This week, the trial between MedMen and its former CFO, James Parker, got underway. Parker stunned the industry with his explosive allegations when he filed his case in 2019. He claimed back then that MedMen founders Adam Bierman and Andrew Modlin were paying brokers to prop up the stock price, amongst other allegations. And he also said that they created a toxic workplace. MedMen says Parker was just a bad CFO who broke his contract. MedMen also named a new COO this week. Hydrofarm bought the company Innovative Growers Equipment for $58 million and lowered their guidance, blaming an oversupply of cannabis. The company now forecasts net sales in the range of $470 to $490 million. Before, the forecast was for over $500 million in sales. And finally, STEM Holdings, also known as Driven by STEM, is buying High Country Supply, better known as Colorado Harvest Company. They are one of Denver's oldest and most respected vertically integrated operators with 2 delivery permits, 3 retail dispensaries, and 2 cultivation facilities. Now, they didn't say what they paid for them, but they did say that the company is expecting $13 million in sales in 2021. And that's it for this week. I'm Deborah Borchardt with the Weed Talk News business update from the Green Market Report.
A back and forth in the Badlands. People in South Dakota voted to legalize adult use cannabis back in 2020, but Governor Kristi Noem challenged it with a lawsuit. Well, this week, a state cannabis committee decided to push forward a new draft bill that would allow that legalization to move forward. The bill must now go before an executive board before it's formally recommended to be taken up by the full legislature next year. For a look at what else is happening in the heartland, here's Brandon Jones with the Missouri Report.
I'm Brandon Jones with Distribution Maven for the Missouri Cannabis Report for Weed Talk News. My first story today comes out of KOMU.com. Missouri marijuana seized by Kansas sheriff under scrutiny. You can't believe this story until I tell you. So a lady was pulled over on May 17th by a Kansas deputy, asked what she was doing. She reported that she was driving from Colorado to Kansas City, that she worked with a cash transfer company, and she was going to go to a couple of medical marijuana dispensaries to pick up cash and then transport it back to Colorado. Well, the deputy let her go, gave her just a warning, and directly after he left, he started a DEA surveillance on her. They watched her go to 5 different dispensaries, get bags, put it into her car, and when she left to go back out of Missouri, To go back to Colorado, she was pulled over by the exact same deputy. He seized over $165,000. And now the federal courts are trying to decide if that money is actually allowed by Kansas to take or if they can get it back. Crazy story. My second story today comes out of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and a key vendor in Missouri's medical marijuana program was hit with a $28 million judgment. So one of the consulting companies that said that they could actually get GMT to be approved was not able to get the companies approved, 4 different dispensary licenses. And so they sued that consulting firm and found that they didn't do enough. They were actually negligent in performing their duties to get the actual licenses approved. So they were hit for $28 million. Be careful if you're a consultant company. Make sure you know what you're doing. You work hard and you take care of dotting your I's and crossing your T's. I'm Brandon Jones with the Missouri Cannabis Report for Weed Talk News. Thanks a lot and have a great weekend.
A few months ago, UPS and FedEx decided they would stop shipping vape-based hardware to that industry. And now the U.S. Postal Service has decided they also would not ship vapes and cartridges in the mail.
And there has been some movement across the political aisle in Washington, D.C. According to Tom Angel's Marijuana Moment News service out of Washington, D.C., 10 Republicans are supporting legalization of cannabis reform. No word on when cannabis reform may come to a vote in Congress. However, this is the first sign that Republicans may start to understand that they should listen to their constituents who do favor legalization. For the rest of the stories from Washington, D.C., here's Vote Pro Podcast's Phil Adams. Phil.
Hi, I'm Phil Adams from Vote Pro Podcast, and this is the Weed Talk News DC report. A federal drug agency says Schedule I classification creates undue barriers to cannabis research. According to a report submitted by Congress by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the myriad restrictions and requirements imposed by the Drug Enforcement Administration has impeded the study into the potential risks and benefits of cannabis to an extent that constitutes a public health concern. Research scientists and institutions cite a lack of transparency regarding DEA requirements, long and unexpected delays in federal authorization, layers of complex regulatory compliance, and limitations on samples available for study. A group of Maryland lawmakers meeting to discuss a process for cannabis legalization in the state are now dealing with the issue of what to do about prior convictions. Members of the House Cannabis Referendum and Legalization Work Group have laid out 3 possible legislative paths to address the hundreds of thousands of cases potentially eligible for some form of clemency. These include expungement, completely removing the case from police and court records, shielding, keeping records of a conviction from public view, and sealing, preventing access to conviction records without a court order. Maryland District Court Chief Judge John P. Morrissey told the work group this week that whichever route is taken will be highly labor-intensive and require manual intervention by hundreds of additional clerks over a period of several years. Yet another study has found teen use of cannabis has not increased as a result of legalization. A survey conducted by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration found that past year cannabis use among teens aged 12 to 17 fell from 13.2% to 10.1% between 2019 and 2020. Use among 18 to 25-year-olds also dropped slightly during that time frame. These findings are consistent with similar studies conducted in recent years by the Journal of the American Medical Association, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the National Center for Education Statistics, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That's the Weed Talk News from around the Beltway. I'm Phil Adams from Vote Pro Podcast.
So, Elena, I admit I'm painfully unhip, especially when it comes to hip hop artists. Have you ever heard of Lil' Kim?
Yes, I have heard of Lil' Kim, Jimmy, but her actual name is Kimberly Denise Jones, and she is introducing a line of flower called Aphrodisiac. It's in partnership with Superbet Inc. So yes, it's another celebrity adding their name on the Pro Cannabis column. But Jimmy, you did hear about this new Harris poll, right? About Americans supporting regulation?
That's regulation, not legalization, since I know 70% of Americans do support cannabis legalization at the federal level, while many in the industry really just want decriminalization first. But that's not what this poll's about, right?
No, this is about proper labeling for legally sold products. In fact, 80% of Americans want better labeling on legal products.
So basically, we're looking for a consumer approval code for legal products, and I'm all for that. You agree, right, Elena?
Yes, that's it.
I mean, there's a lot of money in legal cannabis. They should be able to put a consumer approval legal product label on their product. Yes?
I like it. I like it.
All right. Well, I hope you like Weed Talk News for this week, because as we like to say on this show, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Let's use it responsibly. I'm Jimmy Young from Pro Cannabis Media.
And I'm Elena Pinto from Pro Cannabis Media.
We'll see you next time. PCM TV is supported by Salient Systems, a world leader in video management security, and by Revolutionary Clinics, a medical dispensary where the patient comes first, and by Accounting Buds, your #1 CPA specialist for the cannabis industry. Weed Talk and In the Weeds are two productions of Pro Cannabis Media, supported by Revolutionary Clinics, one of the top medical cannabis dispensaries in the Massachusetts area, now with 3 locations in Greater Boston, 2 in Cambridge and 1 on Broadway in Somerville. Rev Clinics has a patient-first mission. They will customize your needs as a medical patient with the proper titration and combination of strains, flavors, and products. Rev Clinics, where the patient comes first.
Difference is building a solution for that individual, not just a custom, here's a box, here's a video, here's how you make your VMS. We custom design and custom build every situation for exactly what the customer needs. And we keep the costs low. We have multiple tiers, as far as what you're looking at on the cost side of things. If you want a one-time, where you just pay one initial cost, we have that. If you want to maintain your system and have the highest protection and highest capabilities and highest upgrades at all times, we have different plans for you. But we scale it so it's scalable and affordable 100%. Pro Cannabis Media programming is available live and on demand on our Facebook page at Pro Canna Media, on Instagram at Pro Cannabis Media, on LinkedIn also at Pro Cannabis Media, on YouTube and YouTube Live on Pro Cannabis Media, Twitter at Pro Canna Media, and on twitch.tv/Pro Cannabis Media. So like, share, and subscribe to all of our content, newsletters, and shows live or on demand.
We are